Chapter 8:26. Sulu walked towards the tree. Huai Chaoshu heard the sound of footsteps, but she didn't turn around. She picked up her book and stood up from under the tree. Sulu was silent for a moment and then he said, "Actually, I'm a bit surprised. Why did you choose this place?" Huai Chaoshu turned around and calmly looked at him. A sincere smile appeared on her usually cold and detached face. However, this sincere smile appeared on the face of this terrifying highness. It really was a bit hard to get used to. Since I dared to come to the Federation, it naturally wasn't just because I dared. I also made some preparations beforehand. The morning fog nestled against the wetland and slowly moved. It seemed thin, but when layered together, it was enough to block the military satellite surveillance from outside the atmosphere. This was the core area of the wildlife reserve, the area where the Federation's surveillance was the weakest. Sulu withdrew his gaze from the depths of the morning fog and looked at her with a smile. He didn't know what he should say. Sensing his current complicated emotions, Huai Chaoshu paused for a moment, and then continued with a smile. However, the density of the Federation's surveillance still far exceeded my expectations. If it wasn't for the help that woman of yours gave us, which also far exceeded my expectations, I really don't have the confidence to stay here for long. Sulu knew that she was referring to Zhou Yu and that little blue instrument. He scratched his head and explained, "She's not my woman." After saying this, the two of them sank into silence again. The atmosphere under the tree became a bit strange, or perhaps awkward. Regardless of whether it was Sulu or Huai Chaoshu, neither of them were people with extraordinary emotional intelligence like Shi Qinghai. They didn't know what they should say, what kind of topic they should choose to bring this morning fog conversation onto the right track. From a certain perspective, Sulu and Huai Chaoshu were extremely familiar with each other. They had spent a lot of time together in the Empire, participating in intense debates and those terrifying gambling games. They even fought side by side during the rebellion, playing out scene after scene of mythical mecha battles in that ocean-like mulberry forest. However, this kind of familiarity was between enemies. Regardless of whether it was him or Huai Chaoshu, neither of them forgot the electronic explosives planted on his body by the intelligence agency, as well as those cruel punishments. If it wasn't for those twists and turns and coincidences, back then, Sulu would have killed the other party at all costs. Huai Chaoshu was the same. Moreover, in that white courtyard they had both tried it before. And now, they were going to admit their relationship? Sulu thought of what Huai Chaoshu had said in the snow beside the military prison in Qinqing. His gaze couldn't help but become somewhat perplexed and helpless. He had been lonely for many years after losing his family when he was young. It was as if he had just slept, and when he woke up, he found that he had an older sister in the distant universe, and it was very likely that he would have many more relatives. Waking up with a start from a dream and instantly entering another strange dream was a mental shock that not everyone could accept immediately. Even he, who had the thickest nerves, was silent for a long time. Therefore, he asked a question that seemed particularly clumsy in this tense situation. "What book are you reading?" Huai Chaoshu didn't answer. She turned her wrist and turned the cover around. On it was the name of the book, Love in the Charter Era. Sulu scratched his head and sighed. "You're the princess of the Empire. The people in the Federation who want you dead are countless times more than the people who want me dead. Yet, you're actually interested in reading a romance novel?" This is a literary novel. According to the introduction, the author once won the Nebula Award. Huai Chaoshu calmly corrected him. "I still have some difficulties in reading the Federation language, but that doesn't stop me from seeing a lot of metaphors in this novel." The author used the fear and resentment towards the glory of the Charter as a carrier of love. "It's very brilliant and wonderful. You've lived in the Federation for so many years, yet you haven't read this novel. I'm very surprised. I think you need to strengthen your plan in the humanities in the future. Generally speaking, Those who stand outside the wall can easily find metaphors from the meaningless missions done by those who are inside the wall. Sulu argued. He didn't notice that he was still subconsciously standing in the Federation's position. Huai Chaoshu smiled mysteriously and didn't continue the topic. I don't know how long I'll have to wait for you under this tree, so I prepared a few books. The Federation's reading experience is quite good. This is indeed better than the Empire's. Su Li's eyes moved to the bottom of the tree and saw a thick stack of books. He could vaguely see the names of a few books. There was the Charter Chronicles and George Carlin's Research. Noticing his puzzled expression, Huai Chaoshu explained, "Ever since I entered the Federation, especially the Capital Ring, I've observed a lot of details that prove the difference between the Baijin dynasty and the Federation. The Federation is very powerful. To defeat such a powerful enemy, one must first understand the enemy. These folksy books that the intelligence agency doesn't really care about are very good research materials in my opinion." After pausing for a moment, she looked into Su Li's eyes and said, "Of course, now that the one who understands the Federation the most has appeared in the Baijin dynasty, you will be in charge of these matters from now on." This highness tone was calm and normal, as if she was saying that it was his turn to wash the dishes at home tomorrow, but Su Lu understood what she was trying to say. The siblings under the tree in the morning fog were without a doubt the two people who believed in the simplest and most direct creed in the universe. As long as the initial awkward atmosphere was broken, their communication would become very simple and direct. That was why Su Lu simply shook his head and didn't explain too much. Huai Chaoshu looked into his eyes quietly. There was no disappointment or anger as she said, "I know you don't have much feelings for the Empire. After all, you grew up in the Federation and received that rotten education. In your eyes, the Empire's system is primitive and backward, dictatorial and barbaric, so your unwillingness to serve the Empire should be a very real and instinctive reaction." It wasn't rotten education. Su Lu looked back into her eyes and said, "I've been to the Federation. I've seen the Liban star that is currently undergoing a reformation. I've also seen the lives of the Empire's lowly people like pigs and dogs, as well as the miserable scenes of tens of millions of rebel soldiers being crushed into minced meat. In my opinion, even though this Federation isn't perfect, to the extent where it is sometimes disgustingly dirty, no matter what, it is still a bit better than the left Sky Star region." Huai Chaoshu's eyes narrowed, her gaze gradually becoming sharp. If a butcher puts on a mask of hypocrisy and changes the method of killing a pig from a knife to an electric shock, could it be that this proves that he isn't a butcher? Su Lu said in a low voice, "Even if it is a pig, at the very least, it will die a bit more comfortably. This is an extremely small change, but it is actually an extremely important difference." Huai Chaoshu stared into his eyes and slowly put her hands behind her back. She turned around and raised her head to look at the indiscernible end of the morning fog. Calming down her emotions, she said in a low voice, "If you value this change so much, then all the more you should come home with me. Only in this way can you complete this change." Su Lu followed her gaze and looked into the depths of the morning fog, not knowing what was there. After a moment of silence, he replied, "I know myself very well. I know that I absolutely don't have the ability to change that star region. On the other side of the morning fog is the electronic wall." Huai Chaoshu said, "When I first came in contact with this information, I found it hard to understand. The people of the Federation built such a long electronic wall. Why exactly? Did they want to turn humans into monkeys in a zoo for the wild beasts to watch? Later, when I found out that these electronic walls were to protect the wild beasts from being hunted down by humans, I was truly shocked. I really didn't expect that it was actually based on such a ridiculous reason." She did not hide the contempt and mockery on her face at all. Life can only advance through competition. The Federation thinks that they are protecting the ecology by doing this, but they are actually going against the laws of nature. How arrogant! The weak are prey to the strong. This is how it should be said in the language of the Federation, right? These wild beasts are not as strong as humans, so they should be eaten. Life is a process of constant elimination and selection. If this process is forcefully interfered with, in the end, it can only become the current Federation. After 10,000 years of development, there is actually no qualitative leap. It is just like the pool of stagnant water in front of you and me, without the slightest ripple. Huai Chaoshu turned her head and looked coldly at Su Lu. Although the Empire is currently at a disadvantage, as long as it is not destroyed, in at most 30 years, it will be able to completely surpass the Federation. This is the reason. We eat meat and they eat compounds. How can we not win? Her voice was still indifferent and calm, and the language of the Federation was still somewhat stiff. However, these words, especially every word in the last sentence, carried an unquestionable sense of firmness when they were spat out from her thin lips. When they landed on the surface of the wetland, killing intent spread out, startling a few gulls and herons. White wings hid in the fog. A civet cat that was crouching by the pool for its morning drink looked down warily at the tree, then turned around and ran away in fear. Further away, a pride of lions in the long grass appeared to be somewhat restless. The male lion was biting the neck of the female lion, but he did not dare to take a step closer in this direction. I think it is progress for the strong to take the initiative to leave space for the weak to survive. Su Lu looked at her back that was thin but gave off an extremely strong feeling. After a moment of silence, he said, "Besides, the relationship between the social classes of human beings is not completely the same as the relationship between human beings and wild beasts. That's why I said that the education of the Federation is rotten. There has never been absolute equality in human society, not in the Empire, not in the Federation, not in the past, not in the present, and not in the future." Huai Chaoshu turned around and looked at Su Lu expressionlessly. "Don't be too naive. Even the natural human rights that you often speak of are nothing but a joke in my eyes. Why can't the commoners learn the zhenqi that flows in our bodies? Because this is a gift that the Creator has only given to us. Do you think this is also equal? Don't tell me that the Lees of Philadelphia are also members of the royal family of the Empire." Su Lu subconsciously added, and then both he and Huai Chaoshu fell into silence at the same time. This was because a similar conversation had once occurred on the Red Rose and in the Shanghai. At the time, Su Lu had mocked and asked in the end if he was also a member of the royal family of the Empire. The conversation was still the same as before, but the answer was completely different. "We've discussed this question before." Su Li's eyes drooped slightly. "Perhaps we are truly born to be the most powerful people in the universe, but this does not mean that we are born with some sort of special privilege." He pointed to the blue sky above the fog and said, "The charter computer is capturing me. It is stronger than me. Should I surrender to a computer? If I am not willing to be enslaved by it, why should I enslave others?" Chapter 8:27. Morning mist, wetlands, winter trees, siblings. In the distance, the snowy peaks of Macho's former mountain suddenly appeared from the mist, reflecting the morning sun from the east. It arrived on this slope and broke the long silence and inexplicably oppressive atmosphere. "How are you going back to the Empire?" Su Lu asked. Huai Chaoshu calmly looked at him and said without hesitation, "I'm going to take you back with me." He had asked about the method of returning to the Empire, but she had answered about the state of returning to the Empire. During this exchange, a certain emotion entered Su Li's body, making his heart contract slightly. His thick eyebrows rose slightly, and he said in a low voice of self-mockery, "Humanity's training, responsibility. Do you really expect me to go to the Empire and become some crown prince, leading the Imperial armies back to the Federation in the future?" Calmly looking at his slightly tanned and thin face, Huai Chaoshu suddenly said, "Actually, I really wanted to talk about a man's responsibility, Because although I look like a man and have a man's temperament, in the end, I am not a man. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and her hands were behind her back. She looked around indifferently in the light of the morning. Her entire body exuded the unique dominance, or perhaps strength, of a man. For someone like her to say such a thing, it was not funny but rather sad. But I suddenly don't want to say it. I don't want to tell you how many people of the imperial family have died for this war, how many children my father and the other princes have sacrificed for the hero plan. I don't care if you are the last survivor of this plan, nor do I care what benefits you can bring to the empire in this war. She looked into Su Li's eyes and calmly said, I only have you as a little brother. I must bring you back alive. For me, this is the most important matter. In the snowy forest outside Qingqing prison, Huai Chaoshu spoke more briefly, but the meaning she wanted to express was basically the same. Moreover, Su Li believed in the meaning and emotion she wanted to express. As the princess of the empire, crossing the river of stars to come to the Federation, no matter how great the benefits were, could not make up for the losses and risks she and the empire would suffer. Because he believed, he was moved. Because he was moved and confused about his identity, Su Li had been slightly flustered. At this moment, standing under the winter tree in the wetland, he was moved again. He still couldn't call out that name, but Su Li's eyes became calmer and warmer. He thought that perhaps there was no reason in this universe, but perhaps some relationships were really precious. He looked at Huai Chaoshu and noticed that at some point, her hair had been dyed purple. He immediately thought that this was to conceal her identity as a member of the imperial family. But why was it purple? Shuai has already dyed her hair black. Su Li smiled. Huai Chaoshu smiled and said, although she is my sister, she is not related to you by blood, so you don't have to be nervous. Going northwest from the wetland where the two of them were, following the source of the gentle swamp, passing through the entire reserve, climbing up the steep rock mountain, and skimming over the tranquil lake on the other side of the mountain, there was a balcony not far away in a straight line. In the early morning, Lady Tai, who had been woken up by an emergency phone call, stood on the balcony expressionlessly in her pajamas. Her eyes swept across the rippling water as she silently listened to the deep and powerful voice on the phone. The warm and moist air flow converged through some unknown method, making this early winter balcony exceptionally pleasant. Madam, I have already indicated the possible identity of this person. If you insist on providing protection for him, then the government will have no choice but to take legal measures. This concerns the fundamental interests of the Federation, so I will not make any concessions. Hearing President Pabre's resolute voice, Lady Tai's expression didn't change. Her fingers gently slid over the railing, and after a long silence, she said, Mr. President, if the government's intelligence system is still useful, then you should know very well that right now, this guest in the back of Macho Mountain, if he is really the person you guessed he is, then not only does he have a highly respected identity in the Empire, he is also the only pacifist in the upper echelons of the Empire. If you are truly considering the interests of the Federation, then how to treat him is a question worth pondering. Madam, don't you think this is something that the Federation government needs to consider? I don't care if this person of the Empire is a pacifist or not. I only know that he is a great master of the Empire. No matter how you think about it, you personally receiving him is a very wrong choice. There is one point that I must explain clearly. I hope you also heard it very clearly. The winter lake wind blew onto the balcony and landed on Lady Tai's face. Although it was no longer biting cold, her expression was cold and indifferent. She said, from the beginning to the end, I didn't know if he was a great master of the Empire. He is a member of the official diplomatic group of the Empire's resistance organization. He was personally recommended by Commander Mu En to come to the back of Macho Mountain to negotiate the stability of the mining in Galaxy X. Did you hear it clearly? She asked in a deep voice. There was no reply from the other end of the phone. President Pabre should be thinking or controlling his anger after his authority was wantonly challenged. Madame gently held the phone and asked, "During the election, you participated in the killing of my son. Fortunately, nothing happened to Yuan. Now that this layer of paper has been exposed by Shi Qinghai and Su Lu, if you still try to use framing and violence to treat a taxpayer that should be respected, then I will turn you, your government, and all your ambitions into ashes." The way this sentence was put together was as direct and fierce as a woman in the marketplace. The content of the sentence was extremely tyrannical, and even had a crazy feeling of burning the autumn forest and destroying the world. However, it was said in such a calm and indifferent tone, which made it seem particularly terrifying. Without waiting for President Pabre to answer, Lady Tai directly hung up the phone indifferently. She walked into the building from the balcony, and looked at the middle-aged man on the sofa who was fighting with the synthetic meat. Even she couldn't help but be blinked by the extremely bad taste of the Federation's famous brand combination, and the beautiful face that couldn't be suppressed even with such bad taste. She slightly frowned and said with a bitter smile, "Did you sleep well last night?" The master took a tissue and wiped his shiny lips, looked at Lady Tai and said with a sigh, "That prince of ours must be dead. In the entire Federation, other than Madame, where else can I sleep well? Guest from afar, since you already know that your identity has been exposed, how can you still eat?" Lady Tai sat back in the chair, smiled and sipped the tea. With a very casual joke, she officially started the conversation. As the ultimate literature middle-aged man who loves peace and love, the most charming thing about the Federation is its protection of wild animals. The master picked up the fried synthetic meat on the plate and said seriously, "Although the taste of this meat is really terrible, I strongly support the idea of not killing, so I have to finish it to show respect to one of the predecessors in the 5-person group." Madame watched him swallow the piece of synthetic meat with difficulty, then said softly, "I'm very curious, why did you choose the Tai family? Nasri once said that in the Federation, only your family has enough magnanimity and courage to protect a poor foreigner." The master nodded politely to butler Jean, who came to clean up the tableware, then looked at the madam and said miserably, "That prince of ours abandoned a poor person like me without hesitation, so I can only come to ask for your help." "Nasri? I've heard of this name before. It's his nickname in the Empire, right?" Lady Tai responded with a smile, but her right hand holding the chair couldn't help but bend and tremble slightly. "With the close friendship between you and their family, I'm not surprised that you know this name." The madam was silent for a moment, then smiled and said, "But even our Tai family can't protect a master of the Empire for a long time. You have to know that this is making the entire Federation an enemy. I don't want the foundation of the Tai family to be destroyed by the anger of the public. Madam, on the way here, I've already discussed with Mr. Muen. In the future, I will become the spiritual teacher of the underground resistance group and support them on a spiritual level to fight against the Baijin royal family. With my special position in the Empire, the Federation should let me live, right?" The master opened his eyes like a child and looked at her face pitifully. Even with Lady Tai's shrewdness, she couldn't help but be shocked when she suddenly heard this sentence. She said in disbelief, "You want to break ties with the Empire's royal family? My ancestors seem to have done this kind of thing often. Of course, it's mainly on a spiritual level. After that, I didn't see any strong opposition from the Baijin royal family, so it shouldn't be a big deal to do it occasionally." Lady Tai smiled bitterly and said, "Even I can't believe it. Do you think the Federation government will believe it? Just like hearing your fluent and precise Federation language, how can I believe that you didn't specially learn it before coming to the Federation? Our family is full of geniuses. I've heard that the brains of our ancestors even have the terrifying ability to copy memories. As for the Federation language, I often studied Master Schiller's wonderful works in the Empire, so I have some understanding of the language, so this isn't difficult. Master Fan said proudly. When he thought about how Lady Tai had rejected his request to protect him for a long time, his expression became extremely gloomy. Suddenly, he became spirited and said, "Madam, is it convenient to arrange a meeting between me and Mr. Tai Zhuan? Although that child has already passed his coming-of-age ceremony, I'm still in charge of dealing with people of your status. If you have any requests, you can tell me." Lady Tai gently placed the teacup on the table and said casually, but the scene instantly fell into a dead silence. She knew better than anyone else in the Federation what kind of status and ability this seemingly crazy great teacher of the Empire had. Since they were going to negotiate, then someone had to start raising conditions. Master Fan smiled slightly and looked at her. He shook his head and said with a sigh, "It's a pity. My ancestor has left an order that it's strictly forbidden to negotiate with any woman. She's not to be trifled with." Lady Tai was slightly stunned. She didn't expect the other party to refuse to negotiate with her. She frowned slightly and said, "According to the records I know, the first ancestor of your Hua family that appeared in the Empire was a woman." Master Fan smiled slightly and didn't explain. Lady Tai also smiled. She picked up the teacup and took a sip. She sighed and shook her head. Then, she said to Butler Jean beside her, "This tea called Xianer Mei is pretty good. We'll use it in the afternoon tea party. Also, have Shunli inform the President's office that the Crystal Mining Consortium will allow the government to invest funds and that the profits from the mines will be distributed according to proportion." Master Fan's smiling face suddenly became calm and solemn. He calmly looked at the woman holding the teacup. Lady Tai had told him two things in this short conversation. One was a small matter of drinking tea, and the other was a heaven-shaking action that could change the Federation's situation for thousands of years. She told him these two things at the same time, but it just so happened that he felt it was a matter of course. "I'm impressed. This is the true meaning of lifting something heavy as if it were light." He looked at Lady Tai and praised sincerely, "And the conversation on the balcony just now, I have to say that your president is definitely not your match." Chapter 828. It was not an exaggeration to say that the crystal mines were the lifeline of the Federation. The power of intergalactic space travel all depended on them. If there was a problem with the supply of crystal mines, even with the glory of the Charter, the Federation would definitely collapse and fall apart. As for the energy required for the main cannons of the battleships, it was completely negligible. From the mining of mineral stars to the purification of fine craftsmanship to the standard design of crystal engines, the Macho family had always controlled all the core processes related to the Federation. This was the huge return that the Tai dynasty had obtained when they gave up their power by force. It was because of this that the Tai family of the Macho family was always able to have a transcendent position in the Federation. In addition to other hidden forces that had never surfaced, they were always the true leaders of the seven families. While chatting over tea, Lady Tai casually decided to give up some of her exclusive rights. Although she would definitely lay down countless foreshadowing during the specific process of opening up to the Federation, she would definitely not give up the lifeline of her family just like that. However, this decision was still enough to shock the entire Federation and even affect the Left Sky Star region. Such a woman was definitely worthy of the great teacher's evaluation. "You flatter me." An orphan and a widow being forced into such a situation by the Federation. How is it easy? I just have to be easy. Lady Tai had a mysterious smile on her face. She looked at the great teacher and said, "As for the conversation on the balcony, I'm not afraid that you will make fun of me. I've always believed that the most direct method is the most effective method. When the situation allows me to maintain my poise, I might as well maintain it perfectly. When I can't, I can only use my knife. I can be elegant, but I can also be a shrew. As long as what I do is worthy of the family name I've been given after marriage." The great teacher leaned forward slightly and respectfully said, Madam is a traditional woman. I admire you very much. I also admire myself for this. Lady Tai looked at him with a smile, but she sighed in her heart. She had mentioned that the most effective method was to be direct, and that the so-called poise was to remind the other party. However, this beautiful middle-aged man of the Empire did not respond at all. In this situation, he was still unwilling to state his own conditions? After thinking for a moment, she asked politely, "Do you have a daughter?" "I heard that Mr. Tai Xuan already has a fiancée," the great teacher replied with a smile. Lady Tai smiled bitterly, not hiding the deep regret on her face. The government's special forces have surrounded all the exits of the park. Secretary Shen walked behind the madam and looked at the man who was walking out of the garden along the path by the lake. He said softly, "This great teacher shouldn't be able to escape." Lady Tai said calmly, "You came to this conclusion because you don't know what the words great teacher mean in the Empire." Shunli frowned slightly, not understanding what his wife meant. Suddenly, his pupils constricted as he stared at the strange scene. He was so shocked that he couldn't regain his senses for a long time. The great teacher who was walking out of the garden by the lake suddenly slanted his body and stepped on a fallen leaf on the lake with the tip of his foot. He swayed lightly like a water bird dancing gracefully on the surface of the water. In the blink of an eye, he had moved more than 10 meters toward the Winter Mountain on the other side of the lake. The badly matched Federation name tag on the man from the Empire was shining under the morning light. Mixed with the ripples on the lake, it was hard to look at him directly. Secretary Shen opened his mouth wide and his body was abnormally stiff. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was cold in winter, but the Macho Lake never froze. Even if there were a few thin pieces of ice on the surface of the lake, how could it carry such a heavy person? Could it be that the Empire's man could really defy the laws of physics and walk on the lake? When the floating figure disappeared into the forest on the other side of the lake, Secretary Shen couldn't help but believe it. He subconsciously looked at the lake, but other than a few faint ripples, there was nothing strange. Lady Tai calmly looked at the lake and waved her hand. Shunli wiped the sweat on his forehead and left to deal with the government's problem outside the garden. He might not be stronger than Professor Jean, but he might not be as strong as the army god. Butler Jean said respectfully, "It's hard to find someone stronger than the Li brothers, but when it comes to the ingenuity of using it, who could be better than the Empire's great master Fan?" Lady Tai looked at the lake and sighed with mixed feelings. The Hua family is indeed full of geniuses. Before the old master left, I went to Feiqing City to visit him and learned more about him. According to his analysis, the so-called Ba Dao Jinqi should be the innate ability of the Empire's great master Fan Hua family. The Empire's Baijin royal family was just lucky to have a marriage with the Hua family, so they were able to share a part of the Hua family's power. It's a pity that the current great master Fan Hua didn't want to propose any conditions. Otherwise, if Ah Yuan could have a child with a girl from the Hua family, then the 10,000 years curse of the Tai family would be able to end. Butler Jean looked at his wife's side profile and said worriedly, "Young master's health is not bad these years. There are always too many worries in the near future." Lady Tai ignored Butler Jin's hidden persuasion and said, "Ask Ah Yuan to come back from S2. If this great master Fan Hua can escape from the government, arrange for them to meet." Of course, the Hua family was full of geniuses, or else they wouldn't have helped the Huai family become the emperor of the Zhuotian galaxy. The previous great master Fan Hua couldn't have taught two terrifying students like Li Pifu and Feng Yu, and the current great master Fan wouldn't have dared to kidnap the princess of the empire and try to overthrow the emperor. Great Master Fan Hua was sometimes crazy, sometimes wretched, and sometimes artistic, but under his perfect shell, there was a terrifying ability and wisdom. Other than the glory of the Charter of the Federation and his little senior brother, who never played by the rules, he didn't care about anyone. For such a great figure to follow the diplomatic mission to the Federation's capital ring, there was naturally a reason. It wasn't just to retrace the path his father had taken, nor was it just to experience the people of the Federation and find Schiller's unwarranted tombstone to shed tears of literature. Hui Chaosher was here to save her brother, but the great Master Fan Hua's goal was to save the entire universe. A person talking about saving the entire universe was too grand and unreasonable, but he was the only one in the universe who dared to say such a thing, and this idea was very much in line with his belief that he loved literature, peace, and only love. From the great Master Fan's point of view, whether it was the Empire or the Federation, the people's emotions were hard to change, but they were still under the control of the higher-ups. Unfortunately, Emperor Fuchai and the Federation's Pabre government were both extremely tough people, and there was no possibility of persuading them. Thus, he set his sights even further. For the Empire, he had been trying to influence Hui Chaosher, and now there was Su Lo. As for the Federation, he began to pay attention to Mo Chao's back mountain, not because of her superior position in the Federation, but because the heir of the Tai family was running for State Council. The great Master Fan Hua Manor had dealt with the Empire's royal family for countless years and had never suffered a loss, so he was extremely experienced. As for the Tai family's thoughts, the great Master Fan Hua's guess was very accurate. The Tai family was no longer willing to continue hiding behind the scenes, and that young state council member called Tai Zhuan was climbing step by step to the top of the Federation's political power. The great Master Fan Hua didn't mind waiting, but he wanted to communicate with that young council member in advance. Especially after talking with that madam, he was even more certain that the young council member would become the Federation's president in many years' time. This trip to Mo Chao's back mountain had already connected, and the other party didn't hand him over to the Federation government. The tip of the thread was already very beautiful, and the initial goal had already been achieved. As for how to weave this thread into a flower, that would be a matter for the future. Gliding down from the cliff, the tip of his foot stepped on a black bull's horn, causing the bull to raise its head and moo in confusion, but it didn't discover anything. Following that, another foot stepped on the thick back of another bull, bringing the great Master Fan's figure through the white fog like a ghost. The thick morning fog was already showing signs of dispersing, and the slightly humid air hit him in the face. He, who was already in a good mood, wanted to sing at the top of his voice. He finally remembered that this wasn't the Empire where he dared to run naked on the streets, but the Federation that had the glory of the Charter. He forcefully suppressed the singing in his throat, and continued to appear like a flower in the fog, drifting forward. Drifting past the frosty white grass in the wetlands, avoiding the soft wet feces on the gentle slopes, passing through the withered trees that looked like giant potted plums in the winter, looking at the sheep diligently eating grass in the distance, the wild boar sleeping soundly in its own hot feces under his feet, and listening to the mournful cries of the insects under the grass roots under the trees. The great Master Fan really felt like he was floating in the air, and he praised endlessly in his heart. The environment of the Federation is indeed well protected. I'm actually liking that crappy computer more and more. This man who looked like a flower seemed to have some kind of amazing ability. He could sense the flow of the wind and the obstacles in front of him, and he could freely pass through them. However, in the next moment, he suddenly bumped into something in the morning fog. With a muffled bang, he fell heavily to the ground. Covering his bleeding nose, the great Master Fan crawled up from the ground in a hurry. He spat out a few mouthfuls of fresh mud mixed with blood, feeling very lucky that his mouth was not stained with any animal feces. Then, he glared at the fog in front of him furiously and thought, what the F***ck is this thing that's so hard? The fog dispersed, and a man with a cigarette in his mouth pushed out a broken cart. The cart was very old and had only 3 wheels left, but it was very sturdy. Some things that seemed to have just been dug out of the mud were piled up in the metal carriage. It was hard to tell the age of the man with the cigarette in his mouth. His face was somewhat weathered, and the teeth that were biting the cigarette were black and yellow. They were very damaged. An old man pushing a cart? The great master fan stared at the guy. Suddenly, his pupils shrank sharply, overlapping this face with the face from many years ago. A miserable roar came out from his throat. "Nasri, you son of a bitch! Where the hell did you steal my boat?" Chapter 8:29. For some reason, the fog that had gradually thinned out by the rising sun had thickened again. However, it was still enough to see the man walking out of the fog. He wore an ordinary dark-colored coat and sturdy dark blue overalls. A string of tools that sounded like wind chimes hung behind his hip. His weathered face hid his age. Only his yellowish-black teeth clearly indicated his identity. This was because this man had many important identities. In this life, he had fought against the glory of the Charter and had a myriad of incarnations. It was unknown which one he would use today when he suddenly appeared in the wetlands. The most wanted criminal of the Federation, Mechanic Yufeng, the younger brother of war god Li Pifu, Professor Jean of the Second People's Hospital, the spiritual teacher of the anti-government army, George Carlin, or the boss of the Donglin repair shop. Feng Yu pushed the broken car away and reached his hands to his tight buttocks to wipe off the mud. With a cigarette in his mouth, he replied in a muffled voice, "Ship? Of course, I dismantled it a long time ago. Otherwise, how am I supposed to make those damned reference chips?" Hearing this casual and matter-of-fact reply, the great teacher's handsome face suddenly blushed. Naturally, it was not because of shyness but because he was extremely agitated. Back then, his father doted on this little disciple the most and even gave him the family's most important spaceship. In the end it was dismantled. The great teacher took a deep breath. As his body trembled, his hair stood on end, revealing the white flowers that indicated his true age. They were like the white reeds in the wetlands. Roar! With an extremely sorrowful and indignant scream, his body suddenly leaned forward, breaking through the thick fog in front of him and pouncing towards the opposite side. Because his speed was too shocking, as the fog scattered, it was as if countless afterimages could be seen in the air, like countless flowers blooming. Feng Yu's expression did not change in the slightest. He was still holding the burning cigarette between his lips, but his feet had silently sunk into the mud. The string of tools behind his buttocks that made a ringing sound suddenly became incomparably quiet for some reason. Puff, 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 puff. Countless muffled sounds rose and fell in the wetlands. The great teacher, whose body was distorted in the air, was like countless streaks of light as he continuously attacked at high speed. However, in the next moment, the countless afterimages in the air suddenly fused together and then fell heavily onto the wet and soft ground. In the morning fog, a powerful fist slowly retracted. Feng Yu's countenance instantly turned from pale to normal. He looked coldly at the great teacher, who was unable to stand up, and said with a slightly hoarse voice, "After so many years, you still haven't learned that you must be ruthless in a fight. You have great capabilities but are extremely cowardly. You can't bear to hurt others, so you can only let others hurt you. Looks like I have to teach this good-for-nothing son of yours a lesson on behalf of Master. He's always like a woman, what kind of ability can he have?" Master Fan was lying on the wet ground in grief and indignation. Feng Yu took 2 steps forward. Just as he was about to strip the man naked and hang him on a tree to vent his anger for his teacher, he suddenly heard a cold and powerful voice coming from the thick fog. "Who said that women don't have the ability?" This voice, which came from the depths of the morning fog, instantly woke up all the living creatures in the wetlands. The light milky-colored fog rustled and fled into the air in fear. The shivering frost grass quickly lowered their thin bodies that were frozen. A figure came charging out from the light fog. His feet stepped on the grass as if he was stepping on a big drum, making vibrating sounds. It was as if he was only slightly slower than the speed of sound. He was like a clap of thunder with majestic power. Without saying a single word, he flipped his arm and smashed it toward Feng Yu's body. It was simple and direct, without any fancy move. Feng Yu's pupils shrank slightly. He crossed his hands and went up to the figure. He had already expected this encounter, but he really didn't expect that the other party would come so quickly and so fiercely. It was even more powerful than he had imagined. It even made him feel a sense of danger that he hadn't felt for many years. Fist collided with fist, knuckles rubbed against knuckles. Suddenly, the air wave violently spread in the thick fog of the wetlands. The confrontation between the two people didn't make any sound, but the power was as terrifying as a fiery missile. The fog was shaken in an instant, and the surroundings were dark. However, there was a clear space of about 50 meters in radius. The air between heaven and earth seemed to be burning. The two figures flew away as soon as they came into contact. The hard hiking boots with ox tendon soles plowed a deep mark on the wet and soft mud. Feng Yu steadied himself and slowly took the cigarette from the corner of his mouth. He bent his finger and flicked it into the distance in the deep fog. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the young woman in front of him. The corner of his mouth was slightly raised with a trace of ridicule. He said in a hoarse voice, "The blood of the Hua family and the Huai family of Bai Yen have indeed bred a monster in this generation." He coughed softly twice, and his right hand behind his waist trembled slightly. Huai Chaosher looked at him expressionlessly and said, "It's not that I'm very strong. It's that you, Nasri, are old." There was still a misty fog around the wetlands. Only here the morning fog was completely dispersed, and the winter tree on the gentle slope was very clear. Su Lu stood silently under the winter tree, looking at the man who was coughing non-stop. He suddenly said, "Uncle, long time no see." Feng Yu covered his mouth with his fist. He looked up at the tree and said with a smile, "Little guy, long time no see." Su Lu walked slowly from under the tree. He passed by Huai Chaosher and came to him. He focused on the face that he hadn't seen for a long time. He looked at the familiar face of the wind and frost for a long time. It was so long that all the complicated emotions in his heart were forced to become indifferent. Then he asked calmly, "Aren't you dead? Then why don't you die? Why don't you die?" It was a very ridiculous tone, but it clearly conveyed his truest emotions after experiencing so many things and discovering so many unbearable truths. Hearing this, Feng Yu frowned slowly. He didn't hide the anger and ridicule on his face. Su Lu stared into the uncle's eyes and said word by word, "I hate king people who use death to deceive me. I hate people who want to control my life the most. But you did 2 in a row. So I want to ask, why don't you die?" His voice was still calm and gentle, without any emotional fluctuation. Especially when he said the words, King Mother, the rhythm was particularly calm and peaceful, so he sounded more angry and lost. Feng Yu looked at the little guy who had grown up since childhood. He suddenly felt that his eyes were still so small and ridiculous, but some aspects had become a little strange. After a moment of silence, he said with slight ridicule, "Is this all you want to ask?" "Of course not. I do have some questions that I want to get answers from you," Su Lu replied. Feng Yu took out the cigarette case from his pocket. He wanted to smoke, but found that the cigarette case had been crushed by the impact of the energy just now. The cigarette inside had all scattered, like something from the past. He looked up at Su Lu and said, "It just so happens that I also have some questions that I want you to answer. You answer my questions first." "No," Su Lu said without hesitation, "I'll ask first. I'll only let you ask if I'm satisfied with your answers." Feng Yu threw the cigarette case to the ground. He looked at him and said, "You're so rebellious. How dare you talk to me like this? I'll ask first. I'll ask first." Su Lu was unusually tough. He stared into his eyes and didn't budge an inch. Feng Yu was stunned. He confirmed that the guy in front of him was really not the little boy who wore dark goggles and was busy next door. Because of this recognition, he was extremely angry. He waved his arms and scolded, "You ate my food, used my food, and I taught you how to fix things. I taught you how to do things. Is this how you treat me now?" Sulu was even angrier than him. Like a red-eyed bison, he shouted excitedly, "I fixed all the goods. I cooked all the food. I earned all the money. What the f*ck have you done other than using the money I earned to visit prostitutes? Do you think it's still the same as before? I'll do whatever you want me to do? You want to see a policewoman's underwear? I'll play cute outside the window and make her squat down. You're too lazy to look for the brand? I'll go to the sanatorium to ask about the new goods recently. Then I'll be surrounded by a group of prostitutes. You want to eat beef? I'll *king climb over the wall to kill the cow and cut the meat for you. You don't eat when you're old. You don't eat when there's too much blood. You don't eat when the red wine doesn't match. You don't eat when the sunset above the mine isn't beautiful. What the f*ck do you want to eat?" The great teacher and Huai Chaosher, who had just climbed up from the ground, stared blankly at Sulu, who was shouting like a red-hot stone. They couldn't help but be speechless. They thought to themselves, what the f*ck is this? His childhood was too terrible. Who was the one who said that the Federation prioritizes human rights? In Feng Yu's imagination, when he appeared in front of Sulu again, it would definitely be a warm and sentimental reunion. That little boy would throw himself into his arms and listen to him tell him many awesome stories. Then, he would be moved to tears. Who would have thought that it would be such a scene? Back in Donglin, Sulu had once guessed that the owner of his repair shop should be a master. Although Feng Yu was many times more powerful than Sulu had guessed, how could a guy who let his apprentices work to earn money for prostitutes be like a master? Feng Yu was at a loss for words. Suddenly, he felt ashamed and angry. He jumped 3 meters high and roared back unreasonably, "I'm your boss. I'm your teacher. Don't even think about denying this for the rest of your life. You don't even *king respect your teacher anymore. Is there such a thing in the universe?" Sulu stared at him and said in a deep voice, "You've lied to me my whole life. What's the reason for that?" In the midst of the wetland, there was a deathly silence. "Uncle, I'm very strong now. Now, there's an even stronger person standing behind me." Sulu stood in front of Huai Chaosher, looked into Feng Yu's eyes and said, "I think you should accept that the way we communicate has changed. I hope you can answer my questions honestly." Feng Yu laughed. His rotten teeth were particularly dazzling. He said mockingly, "I really didn't expect that there would be someone in this universe who dares to threaten me." Huai Chaosher looked at him expressionlessly and said, "That's because you haven't met anyone who can threaten you. Today, it's a coincidence that there are 3 of them." Master Fan suddenly said excitedly, "Chaosher, he cheated on your father. Sulu, he played with you your whole life. As for me, he stole my family's boat. Everyone, shouldn't we beat him up first before we start chatting?" Feng Yu's expression changed slightly. Then, he looked at Sulu very gently and said, "It's not because you're very strong. It's because the little boy from back then has finally grown up. Let's start a manly conversation." He glanced at Huai Chaosher and said with a smile, "Of course, you're more manly than a man. There's no need to argue." Sulu didn't smile. His expression was unusually calm. He stared at him and asked slowly, "The mine accident that killed my whole family, was it you who did it?" Chapter 830. The living Feng Yu was already a legend. From a certain point of view, he was even more legendary than his dead brother, Li Pifu. If his incredible deeds were gradually discovered by later generations after his death, the human society would immediately become as lively as it was at the beginning of the Big Bang. For such a person, It was probably extremely difficult to find an existence that could threaten him except for the glory of the charter. However, the other 3 people in the morning fog of the wetlands seemed to have the ability to do so more or less, especially Huai Chaosher, who had unceremoniously proven her strength. Therefore, he had to be threatened. This was a very wonderful scene, one that had not appeared in the past 70 years. If the charter computer found these 4 people in the wetlands, it would not hesitate to shoot down the main cannon. More than half of the strong people in the universe would be wiped out, and it would be able to complete many of its historical missions. You know what I mean by family and mind disaster. Feng Yu looked at him with a trace of pity. The morning breeze blew his white hair. After a moment of silence, he replied seriously and calmly, "It's not me." Hearing these 3 words, Su Lu slightly raised his face. Looking at the sky that was still covered by fog, a relaxed smile appeared on his face. Probably because he had gotten rid of the deepest fear of these days, his body suddenly became relaxed and warm, as if he was soaking in warm water. Feng Yu's life was a life full of lies. No one would think that this legendary person would have such a bright temperament that disdained to lie. However, for some reason, just like when Su Lu asked about the big explosion of the Empire before they met for the life and death contract in the mine, as long as he said no, he would believe him. Although he was a cold-blooded and despicable person, Su Lu still believed him, or rather, was willing to believe him. Feng Yu's slender hands rummaged in the broken car for a long time. Like magic, he took out 2 bags of beef jerky, a bottle of red wine, and 4 crystal wine glasses that could be called handicraft. Feng Yu slowly poured the red wine into 2 glasses and threw the rest to the great teacher. The great teacher took the wine and shook his head. Then, he walked towards the winter tree with Huai Chaosher. Master Fan sat against a withered winter tree. Huai Chaosher stood silently under the tree. Su Lu took the wine glass and stood in place. Feng Yu leaned against the broken car and sipped the red wine, letting out a sigh of satisfaction. He habitually touched his pocket and found that it was dry and empty. In front of him, Su Lu took out a blue box of brand 37 cigarettes and handed it over. Feng Yu was slightly taken aback. He smiled and lit a cigarette. Then, he raised the lighter in front of Su Lu. Su Lu thanked him and lowered his head to light the cigarette. He said in a low voice, "Let's talk about these trivial matters. After I came to Donglin, I investigated the mine disaster. It really didn't seem like an accident. It was too close to the residential area and too powerful." Biting the burning cigarette, Feng Yu's eyes pierced through the withered branches of the winter tree and the strange fog that did not disperse. He said, "According to my deduction, the mining accident may have been caused by one of the seeds of the Empire before you. The death of your foster parents and sister would be helpful for you to hide your identity more deeply." Su Lu narrowed his eyes. He vaguely felt that there was something wrong with this deduction. However, he could not see where the problem was. His mood was slightly cold, so he took a deep drag on the cigarette. "With your personality, you definitely don't remember the last words I told you when we parted in the mine. One of them was to make you forget the words revenge." Feng Yu looked at him and said with a frown, "No one knows whether the seed that helped you hide your identity is your distant uncle or cousin. Furthermore, he either left this world because of normal birth, aging, illness, and death. Otherwise, he would have been purged by the Bureau of Proclamation and turned into a ghost. There is no point in you remembering these things." Su Lu did not pay attention to this question. His eyes were cold and determined. It was as if he was looking at the lonely little grave in the west province of Donglin River. He asked in a low voice, "I only know that there were 2 batches of seeds of the Empire. Which batch did that person belong to?" "Not just 2 batches. In fact, it has always been in progress." Under the tree, Huai Chaosher did not drink. She held a piece of beef jerky in her hand and said calmly, "You were in the last batch, but the list of your batch was destroyed. I was the one who destroyed that list." Feng Yu said a shocking fact. Looking at the two people under the winter tree, he said mockingly, "The original purpose of my teacher's seed plan was completely destroyed by that emperor of yours. It was originally to promote the integration of the two sides, but it was turned into the most clumsy spy plan. What was the point of continuing it?" Under the tree, Great Teacher looked at the red wine in his cup that kept reverberating. He thought of his father and sighed faintly. At that time, the federal forces were attacking the Empire's territory, which was before the explosion. Li Pifu and I found out about this at almost the same time. However, we thought that this was a plan that the Empire carried out according to my teacher's last wishes. We did not expect that my teacher had already started this plan many years ago. Therefore, we only know about the last batch. We do not know about the previous ones. Feng Yu used 3 fingers to hold the bottom of the wine glass and gently swirled it. He lowered his gaze and said, "At that time, I had already fallen out with the old man. However, that huge explosion wouldn't happen for another year, so I hated him. However, he didn't hate me that much. I negotiated with him and convinced him that those babies who didn't know anything were innocent. Under the condition that he agreed to remain silent, I promised to enter Tianjing planet for him and destroy that name list. There were very few people in that group, or rather, there were very few infants who were sent into the spatial passage by Huai Fuchai but were lucky enough to survive." He raised his head and looked into Su Li's eyes. "You were the only one." At this moment, Master Fan, who was sitting under the tree, furrowed his brows and quickly moved his fingers. He suddenly raised his head, stared at Feng Yu, and asked, "Was it that time when you snuck into Tianjing planet and abducted my sister?" Huai Chaosher lowered her head slightly to express her attitude. She could not participate in this topic, as it involved the face and dignity of the Empire's royal family. Feng Yu was silent for a moment and did not answer this question. He looked at Su Lu and continued, "The list was destroyed, and the tentacles that Bermuda extended into the Federation were also cut off. Therefore, from then on, no one knew where you, the seed, was, except for me. Father and I only knew that you were still alive and should be in the Federation, but we didn't know where you were. What's your name now? However, we really did not expect you to be in the East Forest, as the executor would usually choose to send the hero to the West Woods or the Upper Forest." Huai Chaosher calmly looked at Su Li's back and said, "If you and Jian Shuer had been engaged before entering the Empire, we would have known that you were not Nasri's illegitimate son. It would have been easier for us to understand everything." The Great Teacher drank a mouthful of red wine, shook his head, and sighed. "Back then, I insisted that you and Jian Shuer were half-siblings. I even thought that Nasri did not care because he was perverted to a certain extent." Feng Yu laughed loudly. "No matter how perverted I am, I can't watch my children commit incest. Furthermore, how could I give birth to such a pedantic son?" Su Lu, who had been silent for a long time, suddenly raised his head. His thick, straight eyebrows furrowed uncontrollably. "Then, the old man should have guessed that I was from the Empire long ago. Before the old man died, he said that I was always by your side because I felt guilty towards you. In that case, he should have guessed this point, but I don't know when." Feng Yu's expression was indifferent. He extended his hand into the slightly cold air. True qi slowly gushed out, and a withered leaf above him fluttered like a butterfly. "This is not difficult to guess. Apart from the perverts of my Li family, those who can have this kind of ability are either surnamed Hua or Huai." Su Lu frowned, and the 2 hands hanging by his side were tightly clenched. He asked gloomily, "Then why didn't he expose me?" "Let's go back to that conversation. The old man talked about you before he died." Feng Yu smiled mockingly and said, "He said that if this was a gamble, then he had already entered the game and would definitely win. He couldn't accept it for the rest of his life. He couldn't understand one thing. Why would his younger brother, who was clearly a member of the Federation, stand on the opposite side of the so-called Federation and fight for the interests of the people of the Empire just because he had a teacher who was from the Empire. He looked at Su Lu and said, "You are from the Empire, but you were raised by the people of the Federation. You lived in the Federation and received the education of the Federation. Li Pifu even raised you at all costs and truly loved you. He just wanted to know if you would be like me and still stand on the side of the Federation even after knowing your true identity." Huai Chaoshu said in a low voice, wishful thinking. Feng Yu looked at Su Lu with a faint smile. "Is that so? Although I think the old man's gamble is very childish, at least for now, I don't think he has lost." Back then, in the military prison of Qinqing, when the Federation's god of war Li Pifu met Su Lu for the first time, no one knew what kind of complicated mental process he went through. Even when the old man fell into eternal sleep in Feiqing, no one knew. But Su Lu himself remembered that meeting very clearly. It was not only because of the awe he felt when he first saw the most extraordinary snowy peak in the universe, but also because of many details of the meeting. At that time, the old man had asked him with an extremely serious expression, "Can you not betray the Federation?" "Of course. If something goes wrong in the future, I will personally kill you." Li Feng. Present. "If in the future Su Lu betrays the Federation and I die of old age, you will be responsible for killing him." "Yes, Marshal. Su Lu, if you can remove the chip, you can go to the Empire and pretend to be a member of the Imperial family." On a cold winter day, sweat suddenly seeped out of his clothes. Su Lu stood on the wetland indifferently, silently thinking that the uncle's guess should be the closest to the truth. That old man should have guessed his true identity from the first time they met. But now, did he count as betraying the Federation? "Nasri, why would your monster brother, who is even more cold-blooded than you, be so impulsive? Disregarding the safety of the foundation of the Federation and nurturing Su Lu, the prince of the Empire, at all costs just to spite you?" The great teacher shook his head and said, "This is not something Li Pifu would do. This is probably what Li Pifu is most willing to do. As long as I don't say it, no one in this world may guess that he is from the Empire. In fact, even if I say it, no one will believe me. Then, if we continue on the usual path, the one who will lead the federal forces to destroy the Empire in the future will definitely be the successor of the god of war, Su Lu." Feng Yu said, "Let the Empire be destroyed in the hands of someone from the Empire. Don't you think this is the most interesting and powerful idea for an old man who has been following the rules all his life?" "It will be exposed one day," Huai Chaoshu said with a frown. "Then it's even more interesting. The new god of war of the Federation is from the Empire. Then what will happen next? Peace?" Feng Yu drank up the red wine in his cup and sneered, "Regarding this bet, he is not betting with me, but with the teacher he killed with his own hands. In my eyes, the old man has been living in the shadow of that incident for the rest of his life. He became the god of war because of it. Every time he is pushed up the altar by the Federation, the shadow in his heart becomes thicker. So, he really wants to know if what the teacher did back then was right." Feng Yu's expression was very sarcastic, and his laughter was very exaggerated and hurried. So King funny. This chapter is about one of the biggest problems of this story. The plot is too important, so it is written too slowly. The third chapter is around 3:00. Actually, there are many times when I really want to strongly suggest that everyone watch the corresponding plot before and after the episode. For example, when Old Manly met Su Lu for the first time, the buttons were left on. I'm worried that everyone will forget, just like what I did in the past. See Chapter 20 here. But later, I feel that I am thinking too highly of myself. Chapter 831. There's nothing funny about this matter to me. Su Lu pinched the cigarette butt and looked around, as if he was looking for an ashtray. Then, he realized how ridiculous he was. He curled his lips in self-mockery and threw the cigarette butt to the ground. He looked up at Feng Yu and said seriously, "If I have the chance to go to the Empire and see that emperor again, I will definitely ask him why he threw me here without my permission." Huai Chaoshu under the winter tree frowned slightly. She was not used to the way Su Lu addressed her. That should be His Majesty or Father, or at least Father. Feng Yu shrugged and finished the last puff of the cigarette. He spat the bitter saliva beside his feet and said, "I agree with that. That guy is indeed a bit perverted. But he is too far away. The old man is already dead. The 3 guys who changed my life are now right in front of me. So, just like how I always asked when I was young, I really want to ask you clearly." Su Lu finished the red wine in the cup and put the cup on the broken cart. He looked at him and asked seriously, "Who are you, you son of AB*TCH? What right do you think you have to control my life? A traveler in the stars? No, the former great teacher might be, but you are not. In the past few decades, you have created so many storms in the universe. Why? Revenge for your teacher? But why do you always stop when you're halfway through? Because you lack patience? Or is it because you are really cold in nature and don't care about anything? You, as George Carlin, opened the iron window above the heads of the people of the lower class and let them see the sun. Then, you started to smash the solid wall with all your might. The students and the anti-government army started to rebel happily. You even gave Cao Qiudao a blue light. The conflict intensified and the war started. Where did you go in the end? You went to the Empire to support the underground resistance. You befriended Mr. Leader and put your other student, Qi Dabing, in there to help him become the next leader. In the end, you returned to the Federation. You just ignored it? You gave birth to a daughter, but in the end, you threw her to the old man you despised the most, while you wandered the universe and enjoyed yourself. You took in an apprentice, and that's me. Look at me now, don't you feel guilty? People from the Empire? People from the Federation? Thank you. I've lived for more than 20 years, but I still don't know who I am. I don't even know what I should be called. Do you think this is fun?" Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at him. He spread out his hands and asked seriously, "Uncle Boss, have you really never known how to write the word responsibility in your life?" Feng Yu silently listened to him venting his emotions. Suddenly, he raised his eyebrows and said mockingly, "Responsibility? Why should I be responsible? How can I be responsible? I hate those 7 families that like to show off and are powerless, so I'm George Carlin, who debunks the hypocrisy and truth of society. I want to see those families beaten to the ground, but this doesn't mean that I'm going to carry the flag for those stupid people on the battlefield, because they want to pursue their own interests. Why should I expect a savior to complete everything?" Feng Yu's voice was full of mockery. Back then, Professor George Carlin supported the students in the capital university to run a free newspaper. In the newspaper, he scolded the cowardly government, the incompetent army, and the mummified families that liked to sit in armchairs. He scolded everything from the president's wife to the eccentricity of the Liyuan Palace. Later, the Sanlin Bank sent a huge sum of money. The students held a meeting with 2 topics. First, should they accept it? The conclusion was to accept it. Second, should they still scold them after accepting it? The conclusion was to still scold them. The reason was that they were shareholders after accepting the money. If they were shareholders, they naturally deserved to be scolded. I went to say that the students shouldn't have accepted the money. The students were unhappy and asked if the newspaper didn't need capital stock. I said that it wasn't capital stock. They asked what it was. As the story was told, Feng Yu's voice became sharper and sharper. He looked at Su Lu and shook his head. At that time, I wanted to say that it was a bribe. But when I found that the students in the newspaper mainly used the money to flirt with girls, I thought that it should be called whoring funding. So I stopped paying attention to the newspaper. The advanced young students had a huge amount of capital stock and naturally didn't need my signboard. They still scolded and were still happy. In the end, they were caught by the police in an unlicensed brothel and were charged with the crime of incest. Only then did this matter come to an end. Of course, I didn't think that these students should go to jail for 2 or 3 years just because they scolded a few people. So I went to the Liuan Palace and borrowed his small round hat to play with for 2 days. But this matter made me understand some things. These were some young students who had received higher education. If even they were so stupid and bastards, then why should I be responsible for the people who were even more stupid and bastards? What information asymmetry? What dark family? What unfair legal system? It's all fake. Humans are a very inexplicable creature. All the vile and despicable things are in everyone. Feng Yu spread out his hands and said with a smile, "As for the other things you want me to be responsible for, how can I be responsible for the teacher who died in the hands of his own brother? Kill him directly? Well, even if I killed my family for personal vengeance, I still have to be able to kill him. Does this count as being responsible? I fell in love with a little girl when I was middle-aged. After she grew up, she took the risk of escaping from the imperial palace. I was just about to take her away when the house she lived in was blown to pieces by the Federation's missiles. Her body wasn't even found. How can I be responsible? I had just found my daughter when I was discovered by that damn charter computer. Tell me, how should I be responsible? Does that big explosion count? Does it count that I became the most wanted criminal of the Federation? Does it count that the old man finally broke up with me? Does it count that my rotten teeth? Does it count that the best friend of my life was in a cold war with the woman he loved most in the last few years before his death, because he refused to sign the arrest warrant? His smile was very cold, and his tone was very calm. But in this long paragraph, countless words were like countless sharp alloy knives that slashed at the quiet wetland, the thick fog, and the sky above the winter tree, leaving deep marks and scars everywhere. It was so sad that it was about to crack. Su Lu pursed his lips tightly and looked at him silently. Under the winter tree, the great teacher's mood was gloomy. There was a faint sadness in his eyes, probably because he thought of his dear sister and his other niece that he had never met before. Huai Chaoshi, who was usually indifferent, had the most complicated expression at this moment. She was a little sad and a little lonely. She said in a low voice in self-mockery, "I don't care about the internal affairs of the Federation that you're talking about. When my mother fled the royal palace, I already have some vague memories. If she was still alive, I would like to ask her if she was responsible for abandoning her husband and daughter like this. When I first met your mother, she was just born. I watched her grow up, so I know her very well." Feng Yu's eyes were cold as he said slowly, "Although I didn't have the chance to ask her, I believe that the pain she felt when she left you was no less than yours." Then he continued indifferently, "The people I knew back then all said that I was heartless, cold-blooded, and irresponsible, but who in this world has ever been responsible for me? I told Li Pifu that my epitaph in the future will be, 'I won't forgive anyone, and you don't have to forgive me either.'" A gentle breeze blew over, carrying a faint mist. Feng Yu's unkempt hair trembled in the wind. Only now did Su Lu notice that the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes were much deeper than before, and the silver at the roots of his hair was unusually striking. Perhaps it was because Li Pifu was already dead and the uncle had lost his last opponent in the universe. His eyes were wide and empty, so he appeared much older. "Uncle, you're not someone who needs sympathy." After a moment of silence, Su Lu said, "I never participated in your history, so I don't need to forgive you, and I also don't have anything that requires your forgiveness. I want to make this clear." Feng Yu smiled in relief and said, "This is what I want to see. Teacher has been very good to me since I was young. He even gave me that ship. I have nothing to repay him with, so I chose to go to Donglin to watch you grow up. After all, I thought that you were the last seed in his plan, but in the beginning, I didn't plan to participate in your life. I didn't even plan to tell you about my true background. I remember that I once asked you why you chose me when there were so many repair shops in Donglin. Now, I vaguely understand that this is probably fate. Feng Yu raised his head and looked at the blurry sky that seemed to have countless faces like him. He said slowly, "Since you found me, then I can only bear this responsibility." "You asked me if I've ever been responsible? At least you count as one." He lowered his head and looked at Su Lu. He said indifferently, "My way of being responsible has always been different from others. I hoped that you would become a strong man who dared to hurt others and prevent yourself from being hurt, but I didn't expect that you would inexplicably become a good and detestable rock. So when you said that you won't forgive me, I'm very relieved. A man living in the stars should be an evil guest." Deep underground of the Bureau of Proclamation building, rows of data compiled in green machine language flowed on the giant 2D light screen. There was no Bureau of Proclamation staff in the spacious space. Only the data mixed with the faint sound of static electricity flowing at high speed, like a dark green waterfall. Other than some extremely strange and abnormal geniuses, no one could see or understand the true meaning of the machine language. Naturally, no one could see it clearly. Every 5 seconds, the image of an eye would appear in the green waterfall of data. It would appear for about 0.001 seconds. The eye had no human emotions. It seemed to be looking up into the distance. It was unknown where the indifferent gaze was looking through the countless meters of underground. Abnormalities 1 to 73 have been overlapped. The bait plan will enter the next phase. Draw up an attack plan and submit it to the relevant departments for approval. Warning: this is the first sequence of events. The Federal Central Computer coldly issued the warning. Then, the precise coordinates of the center of the wetland shrouded in thick fog were transmitted at the speed of light to the qualified departments. Chapter 832. Evil Guest? I've always paid for my meals. In the morning mist and wetland, Su Li's unrestrained rebuttal rang out. It was obvious that he did not intend to show any mercy to a certain person's conclusion that was full of life insights. You walk among the stars, shaking your big ass everywhere and pretending to be an evil guest. Then what am I? Don't I need to pay for the meal on your table after it's finished? Then, after so many years, you just sit down and sigh with a few words and call it a day? Even if you can threaten me, even if I'm old, shouldn't you at least treat me with a better attitude? Respecting the elderly is a form of courtesy. Feng Yu raised his eyebrows and roared at him. Yes, I didn't take care of you much in the East Forest, but without that cannon of mine, do you think that the infatuated princess, who thinks that she can tear apart the universe with brute force, could have escaped from that deadly prison? Huai Chaosher glanced at him coldly with an expressionless face. Su Lu had long guessed that the main cannon of the battleship that came from beyond the atmosphere and blasted through the snowy night had something to do with the man in front of him, but he had no intention of thanking him at all. He said mockingly, "Old people are often as smug as children. It's really hard to respect them. I know that you are still immersed in the self-identity disorder and the inner struggles of those so-called artistic youths, so I don't blame you for losing your composure. I will take responsibility for you." Feng Yu paused for a moment and said calmly, "Go to the Empire, little guy. I believe that as long as you return to the Empire, the stories that will happen in the future should be able to mend your fragile heart and satisfy the ridiculous morals in your heart." Su Lu looked at him in silence, waiting for his explanation. Regarding this war, there is only one result. Between the Federation and the Empire, whoever can integrate the resources more effectively will obtain the final victory. In other words, the one who monopolizes power will definitely win. The president of the Federation, who likes to pretend to be a minor, saw through it a long time ago. That's why he wants to have power like an emperor. The people and the parliament are easy to deal with, but the few big families are a problem that he has to deal with. The problem with the Federation lies in the families that share a symbiotic relationship with it. If we ignore them, they will consume the flesh of the Federation, causing it to age, harden, and decay day by day. But if we try to dig out these tumors, the Federation will bleed to death. Feng Yu said mockingly, "If I can't do it, who else can? On the contrary, your Emperor in Left Sky Star area is cold-blooded, a bastard, and a hypocrite. Look at how he dealt with Keaton and the other princes. In the next 30 years, no one can shake his throne. Therefore, the Empire will definitely win." This was a war that spanned across the River of Stars and was very likely to set the entire universe ablaze. Yet, this man with a mouth full of rotten teeth in the morning mist casually pointed out the final outcome. Some of the 3 people present were willing to believe it, while others were unwilling to. However, they had to admit that even though this reasoning was simple and even unreasonable, since it came from his mouth, it was extremely powerful. Just like how he was so confident and even narcissistic when he mentioned the problems within the Federation, it was completely unquestionable. Even he could not overthrow the 7 great families, so how could the current government do it? You are not a guy who can watch your biological parents beat your adoptive parents until they are covered in blood without saying anything. Feng Yu looked at Su Lu and said, "Teacher wants peace. Right now, you should be in great need of this mental soothing agent. Therefore, you must return to the Empire and return to the side of that Emperor of yours. You can even try being the Emperor for a few days for fun." Under the winter tree, the great teacher stood up with the help of the tree trunk. Rubbing his back, he said, "The one who wants peace is my father. I will give it to him. I don't need a guy like you to meddle." Huai Chaoshu put down the wine cup in his hand and looked at Su Lu. "What we want is victory. Peace can only be the spoils of war after victory. But right now I don't want anything, because these things have nothing to do with me." Su Lu shook his head and looked at Feng Yu. "In the end, my life has been played by you people. Please allow me to raise my middle finger to you old people from the depths of my heart. Furthermore, I don't want to continue being controlled by you people in the future." He raised his left hand. The metal bracelet on his wrist seemed exceptionally holy in the milky mist. "I will not return this bracelet to you. Just treat it as the compensation you gave me on behalf of everyone in the first half of my life." Then, he shrugged and continued, "Furthermore, I believe that I deserve that sentence more than you do. In this aspect, I have the confidence to show off a little." Feng Yu looked at him and spread out his hand. "I have already returned that stupid electronic watch of yours to you. I snatched it from that idiotic student of yours." Su Lu did not back down. "I am very unhappy that you threw away the thing I gave you to someone else," Feng Yu said in disgust. "I mainly wanted to tell you that I am still alive. I don't want a little boy in this world to cry whenever he thinks of me." He scratched his head and said, "You should have finished asking your questions. It's my turn. I just want to know what's going on between you and that broken computer, and where did you get that weird permission from?" "I accepted the initiative to contact you." Su Lu gave a simple answer. Some remnant information in the chip activated a backdoor program of the Federal Central Computer. Thus, I became the first target of protection. Remnant information? Feng Yu's brows furrowed as he thought of some very important questions. However, he did not explain anything. After a moment of silence, a faint self-deprecating smile appeared on his face as he said, "I escaped under its nose for several decades. Only now do I know that I actually had 71 chances to talk to that guy directly." "Do you regret it?" Su Lu mocked. "No." Feng Yu raised his eyebrows and laughed. "Talking to a stupid computer directly is too stupid." The strange and thick fog in the morning finally could not withstand the invasion of the sun and gradually showed signs of dissipating. Sulu looked at the uncle's weathered face and said, "Uncle, I don't care if you really dismantled that ship or not, but I know that you have a way to take them away from the Federation. Please take them away." Hearing this, Huai Chaoshu, who was under the winter tree, frowned. She did not expect that Sulu would still insist on not returning to the Empire with her under such circumstances. "What about you?" Feng Yu looked at his student with a smile that was not a smile and said, "You insist on staying." Master Fan suddenly thought of something and his expression changed slightly. He took 2 steps forward from under the tree and said in shock, "Kid, do you really want to learn from that guy in the 8-part opera and commit suicide in the end? Although you call this a hero plan and the Federation once made me a hero, I know very well that I am not cut out to be a hero. Of course, I will not commit suicide." Sula looked at them and said with a smile, "We are not in the same boat, at least for now. Therefore, I will not board your boat. Besides, who knows when I will have my own boat. You want to stay and compare yourself with that stupid computer? You want to stay and test the level of evil in people's hearts?" Feng Yu replied with a smile, "Being a hipster is indeed a disease. You will die. I don't think the charter computer is very strong. I have endured it for the past 2 days by myself." "No," Feng Yu said with a slight mocking tone, "you think it is not strong because it does not want you to think it is strong. Even if it is a stupid computer, it is still the most powerful stupid computer in the universe. Regarding these aspects, you are still too inexperienced. Therefore, you cannot understand its current thoughts. In about 3 minutes, a dense barrage of missiles and battleship main cannons will cover the area we are in now." Feng Yu took down a broken computer from the broken cart and pointed at the data stream on the screen of the workbench. He looked at the 3 of them and said with a smile, "I have never really defeated it in my life, but believe me, as long as I am alive, it will not be able to defeat me." On the 2-dimensional screen in the basement of the Bureau of Proclamation, the data stream compiled by the dark green mechanical language was still flowing. Just like how it had been for tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years, there was no pause or change. The Federal Central Computer calculated all the missions with a cold mechanical mind and ordered them strictly according to the order and the degree of danger. For it, Feng Yu, who had countless identities, was undoubtedly a more important target than Su Lo. From the moment the Morning Dawn launched its main cannons during the riot in the military prison of Qinqing, the anomalies of missions 1 to 71 and 73 entered its field of vision. It used the fastest speed to draft a capture or elimination plan, which it named Bait. Just as Feng Yu had deduced, the real ability of the Federal Central Computer was definitely more powerful than what Su Lo had felt these days. However, the powerful and unshakable priority of the plan had created such a situation. If it was described in terms of anthropomorphic thinking, it was probably deliberately showing weakness to lure more important enemies into the encirclement. The overlapping of anomalies and the arrival of additional important targets directly triggered the relevant program. From the perspective of the plan, the Federal Central Computer's arrangements and calculations were very precise and perfect. There was nothing to nitpick about. The elimination plan was to be carried out in an uninhabited wildlife sanctuary. Although the dense fog affected the fixed location of the military satellite to a certain extent, as long as the amount of ammunition was increased, it could still guarantee that the targets would be completely eliminated in the first place. The 3 battleships on standby outside the atmosphere were ready to launch their main cannons. A certain land missile base in South Kazhou had launched a powerful missile. However, as time passed, the missile was still not launched. The plan drawn up by the Federal Central Computer had encountered some kind of setback. It had nothing to do with the data stream that had quietly snuck into the light and then disappeared like a thief. The Federal Central Computer had already done the core data protection. The green data stream on the 2-dimensional light screen flowed slowly. After an unknown amount of time, the image of the eye that appeared once every 5 seconds quietly emerged. It calmly and silently watched the humans in the Bureau of Proclamation building and the officials who were fiercely debating in the official residence. It could not understand why its plan was so perfect and simple, but these humans were unable to carry it out. It had been at least 7 minutes since the alarm was sent and the request was submitted. However, the humans who had the authority still had not made a decision. Unable to directly carry out physical operations, the Federal Central Computer had to work under the orders of the humans. Therefore, it could only wait in silence. It could not even feel angry. It was so lonely and lonely. Chapter 833. In the underground meeting room of the President's residence, the heated argument was still going on. The National Security Advisor slammed the table angrily and yelled at the Bureau of Proclamation official in front of him. "There are only 4 targets in total, and we have to send out 3 warships, and hundreds of Inferno missiles are going to be fired at them? Who the F***ck came up with this plan? Is there something wrong with the charter computer? Sir, those aren't normal targets. The current situation is that even if the Bureau of Proclamation activates the program to open the electronic fence, by the time the special forces arrive, those 4 people will have already escaped. The most important thing is that none of us are confident that we can capture these people with our ground forces." The Deputy Minister of Defense retorted with a gloomy face, "Hundreds of Inferno missiles and warships do seem exaggerated, but we really need such powerful firepower. If the charter computer didn't make a mistake, other than Su Lu, the Empire's princess, and the Empire's great teacher, the other person is the mechanic Yu Feng. 6 years ago, when the 4 military regions carried out the last assassination mission, they sent out mecha teams and warships, but they still let him escape. Sir, I hope you won't forget this point." Sitting at the end of the long table, General Li Jiedu had been silent the whole time. He looked at the operation plan in front of him thoughtfully. His digital pen lightly moved, and no one knew what he was thinking. The old man who appeared in the middle of the wetland was his uncle, the person he was most wary of after that night of coffin support. He had hoped countless times that this person wouldn't appear, but in the end, that person still came. "As a member of the Federation, of course I know the importance of those 4 targets, but I have to remind you of one thing." The National Security Advisor pointed at the electronic map on the screen and roared, "The protected area is close to the back of Macho Mountain. The target location is less than 7 kilometers away from the manor. That is the Tai family area recognized by the government. What do the missiles and warships mean? Could it be that they want to declare war on Lady Tai? Or is the government ready to declare war on all 7 families?" He took out a handkerchief and wiped the sweat on his forehead. Coldly looking around, he said in a hoarse voice, "You are only thinking about the war between the Federation and the Imperium, but I am more worried about whether the Federation will officially enter a civil war because of this attack." There was silence in the conference room. The generals and officials knew very well that what the security advisor was worried about was very frightening. However, the Federation would not allow such a situation to happen if they did not launch an attack while the Empire's princess was right in front of them. Li Jiedu, who had been silent all this while, suddenly spoke, "Launch a warship attack." The Deputy Minister of Defense beside him frowned and said, "The main cannon of the warship is an instant attack. Logically speaking, there should be no problem. However, mechanic Yu Feng can't use conventional logic. Without missiles to increase the coverage, the attack is very likely to fail." At this moment, the heavy alloy door of the conference room slid open smoothly, and President Pabre, who had forcibly interrupted an important trip, hurried in. He waved his hand to stop everyone from standing up and saluting, and said in a deep and powerful voice, "Execute the plan according to the central computer." The generals and officials in the conference room were slightly stunned. Their expressions were all different, and they immediately began to implement the battle plan. The president placed his hands on the table and silently looked at the light screen above his head. His expression was abnormally solemn. The madam of the back mountain had just made a decision that shook him. She had opened up the crystal mining consortium. In the face of such a concession, the government had to make a corresponding response. The Parliament Hill needed a very long time to review the matter. However, could the government's response be the attack of the warship's main cannon and countless missiles? In terms of political stability, the president should have chosen a more reliable method, but he did not. He directly and forcefully issued the order to attack, because in the center of that wetland were two important figures of the Empire, the most wanted criminal of the Federation, and more importantly, Sulu was there. President Pabre looked at Li Jadu and said expressionlessly, "I will immediately call Lady Tai to avoid causing her to make a wrong judgment." "That madam will not make a wrong judgment. The troublesome thing is that she is very willing to make a wrong judgment and then seek the relevant benefits," Li Jadu calmly replied. "Some people can use the overall benefits of the Federation to bargain, but we cannot." The president looked at the satellite image on the light screen and looked at the ground that was faintly discernible in the fog. He said indifferently, "We must be responsible for the Federation." In the center of the wetland, the winter tree gradually became more and more blurred behind the several figures. Mechanical calculation is never a real thought process. The seemingly omnipotent central computer of the Federation is actually not that scary. No matter how powerful the tool is, it is just a broken tool in the hands of the stupid and indecisive human. Uncle Feng Yu reached out and took the box of brand 37 cigarettes from Su Lo, who was pushing the cart. He took out a cigarette and lit it. He walked slowly and talked slowly, completely ignoring the countdown and the possibility of the imminent terrorist attack. His disdainful and indifferent expression was incomparably powerful and vigorous. There is a theory that the key point of the official origin of human beings before the catastrophe was learning how to use tools. In my opinion, it is very regretful or shameful that human beings have not evolved a bit since then, especially the way they use tools is still so clumsy. Feng Yu glanced at the broken light screen of the broken computer on the broken cart and shrugged. Even if the central computer has protected the core data, it is meaningless. It has to wait for someone to give the order. But people have to think, if they throw a bomb here, what will the old woman behind the mountain in front think? I didn't choose this place blindly. On the other side of the broken cart, Huai Chaosher suddenly frowned and asked, "You chose this place?" "Of course." Feng Yu proudly lifted the black hair in front of his forehead, revealing his true colors below. "The data in your intelligence department were all left by me. Otherwise, which agent of the Imperium do you think could have chosen such a good place for you?" Su Li's expression changed slightly, and he lowered his head and continued to push the cart in silence. Although he had roared angrily about the miserable life of child labor earlier, some things had been deeply rooted in his bones, such as working as a coolie for the uncle, and such as standing on the Federation's side habitually and thinking as a person of the Federation, especially a soldier of the Federation. "Can your expression not be so stiff?" Feng Yu looked at him mockingly. "You are not a person of the Federation, I am. Besides, other than your crazy and perverted sister, who do you think can use this data?" At this moment, a low humming sound came from the sky far away, as if several grand pianos were playing at the same time in an empty room. Sulu narrowed his eyes, but he did not turn around. He knew that countless missiles were tearing apart the fog and flying toward the winter tree behind him. Feng Yu and Huai Chaosher, who were walking on the two sides of the broken cart, were indifferent and did not turn around. But Great Teacher, who was walking at the front, looked back, only to discover that the morning fog where everybody had been had strangely disappeared. The wetland was clear and bright, and the winter tree had disappeared at some point. Where it had been standing stubbornly before, a few soundless black holes could be vaguely seen. 300 Ardent Fire 2 missiles were launched, and countless explosions rang out one after another, as if the deepest drum of an orchestra was beating the ground. The wet land began to tremble. The frost-white grass, the gradually solidifying ice, and the remaining branches were dismembered by the cheers of the high-energy explosives. The debris that they turned into at the cost of their lives drifted in the air. Before they could fall, they began to burn fiercely again, turning into a real fire that covered several kilometers. At the edge of the raging fire, there were 4 people who seemed to be leaving slowly but were actually leaving quickly. They were not riding horses nor carrying sticks. They were just pushing a small cart. They were not afraid or flustered. Even the burning wilderness behind them could not make them stay silent for a while. The uncle leaned against the broken cart lazily with a cigarette between his lips, blowing a cheerful whistle that was not sad at all, as if he were playing the accompaniment for the terrifying explosion behind him. Walking to a nameless puddle, Sulu looked at the uncle next to the cart and could not help but remark, "Uncle, I have to admit that your narcissism is very reasonable. You are indeed vigorous." "This is vigorous? When I was vigorous, I was much more vigorous than this. Pure seafood." Feng Yu looked at him and said mockingly, "To deal with that broken computer, it is not enough to understand it. The more important thing is to understand those who use it. What are those government officials and generals thinking in their heads, what are they hesitating about, and what can we use in between?" Tools were used by humans. To fight against a powerful tool was, in fact, to fight against the people who used it. This seemed to be a very simple principle, but Sulu knew very well how difficult it was to use this method to find the gaps between those lights, because the complexity of the human thought pattern was even more complex than that of the charter computer. "This is not difficult." Feng Yu looked at him and said indifferently, "When you turn this judgment into some kind of vague instinct like me, there won't be any problems. But since you insist on not getting on my boat, when you are chased by that broken computer in the future, don't cry and ask me to be your uncle." Sulu listened silently and seriously. Then he smiled, knowing that the uncle had taught him the most important lesson today. Then his smile gradually faded, knowing that it was time to say goodbye after they had just reunited. What made him a little confused and at a loss was that this separation was the result of his own persistence, and he could not even clearly explain why he was so insistent. Feng Yu removed the cigarette from between his lips and raised his head to look at the steep cliff not far away. His usually arrogant and indifferent face that was full of vicissitudes of life suddenly showed a rare trace of emotion. The old man said that he had already entered this gamble, and would definitely win. "It probably means that he has seen through you. You little guy are a stinking rock, and you won't give up until you are smashed into pieces." Feng Yu said thoughtfully, "You are all the same kind of people, always liking to gamble with your lives. But in my opinion, life should not be wasted like this. If you care too much about something, you will be dragged into the abyss by those things, and it will be difficult to rise again." He raised his head and looked at the clear blue sky that was gradually revealing its true appearance. He said mockingly, "Just like this crappy computer of yours. More than 10 billion dogs are chained to the Federation, but in the end you have become a dog for more than 10 billion people." Chapter 834. Anything that you care about can be a dog chain? Yes. Including hometown, lover, hot-bloodedness, honor, comrades? Yes. Sulu looked at the white cliff reflected in the shallow pool in front of him. After a moment of silence, he raised his head and looked at Feng Yu with a smile. "I also don't want to be tied by a dog chain, even if it's related by blood or something like that. So, I have to break free with force and then walk my own path." Feng Yu looked at him calmly. "Even if it means death?" "Even if it means death." Sulu turned around and looked at White Sausher's messy and slightly dirty purple hair. He looked at her ordinary face and looked at her small eyes. "Sorry, I'm very grateful for you coming, but I really can't leave with you." After saying this, he hesitated for a moment and then opened his arms somewhat stiffly. Huai Caosher's expression froze slightly. She opened her arms like him, right arm slightly up, left arm slightly down, and slowly and hesitantly took a step forward. The two of them crossed their arms somewhat awkwardly. Their upper bodies leaned forward and gently hugged like two pieces of wood. Then they separated. "Can you promise me one thing?" Sula looked into her eyes and said softly. Huai Caosher looked at him quietly. Sula hesitated again and said with some difficulty, "The thing you took from Zhou Yu is too big of a threat to the Federation. After we return to the Empire, can I trouble you to destroy it?" Huai Caosher's eyes gradually narrowed. There was some coldness and faint disappointment in her eyes. Sulu knew that there was no way for him to not be angry when he said something like this at this moment. He lowered his head and said, "If that thing falls into your hands and is cracked, too many people in the federal forces on the front lines will die. Although probably no one thinks so right now, some of them are my subordinates and comrades after all." "Then, have you ever thought about how many fewer Imperial soldiers would die if that little blue device was cracked? And they are your real compatriots?" Huai Caosher narrowed his eyes and slowly clenched his fists. After a while, he slowly released them and said with a trace of tiredness that was difficult to suppress, "I promise you." "Thank you," Sulu said. "I know you're disappointed. I'm sorry." Huai Caosher looked at him coldly and said, "I know what kind of person you are, so my real disappointment is that since you don't want to go home with me, your last words before leaving are actually this." That wasn't the last sentence. Sula looked at her and paused for a very long time. Then, he said, "I will go to the Empire to see your sister." Hearing these two words, Huai Caosher's narrowed eyes slowly relaxed. The lines and expression on her face that seemed to be carved from steel suddenly melted into the branches of spring. She reached out and patted Su Li's shoulder. Without saying anything, she turned around and left. Crossing the River of Stars to come to the Federation, disregarding the risk of life and death, even throwing the Empire and all of her responsibilities to the back of her mind, this most powerful princess just wanted to bring her younger brother home. Even though her wish was not fulfilled, she was already satisfied to hear the last two words. The wilderness was full of the pungent smell of residual fire and ammunition. The frosty grass by the wetland was completely withered and charred. The three people walked into the smoke. They could faintly hear some very unnutritious dialogue. They could vaguely imagine what kind of story would happen in the long journey that followed. "I didn't expect that I would have to be a nanny for once when I'm old." This was the uncle's arrogant and infuriating sigh. "Nasri, I definitely don't mind beating you until you can't take care of yourself." This was Huai Caosher's calm and confident threat. "Yes, I'm very willing to be his nanny in this situation." This was the direct expression of a master. Seeing those figures disappear into the wildfire and wild grass, Su Lu slowly retracted his gaze. He tidied up his equipment and silently left to the other side, his face expressionless. He could not go back to the Empire with Huai Caosher. He had killed too many people from the Empire. Macklin was his uncle, and that butcher Keaton should also be some kind of relative. In this kind of situation, he did not know how to face that strange country. This was not the key to the matter. He believed that Her Majesty had enough methods and iron blood to suppress all voices of dissent. The real key was that he had been to the Empire before. He did not like the Empire. Compared to the Dark Federation, the human world of the Left Heaven Star region was even more naked and dark. He could not imagine that he would live a peaceful life in that kind of hierarchical society and enjoy the blood and sustenance of hundreds of millions of lowly people. He could not imagine that he would one day lead the Imperial Royal Army to fight against the Federation. He could not imagine that one day he might run into the 17th Division. He lay, Xiong Linquan, Hua Xiaoxi, Gu Shifeng, and the others on the battlefield, but he had to raise the gun in his hand. Wander together with the uncle? A slightly cold pain appeared in the depths of Su Li's eyes. The uncle had just said that the mine disaster that killed his parents and Xian Yi was caused by the previous generation of seeds of the empire, but other than him, even the imperial royal family did not know where he was, so how could that seed of the empire know? He walked alone in the wetlands and entered the short shrubs at the foot of the mountain. He did not pay attention to the fighter jets whistling through the sky. His heart was heavy and frustrated. He could not go to the Empire, and he could not stay in the Federation. The universe was so big, so where should he go? At the edge of the new moonlight and shadow, a quiet and broken tri-winged spaceship floated in the dark space. Inside this spaceship that looked down on human society like a ghost, an angry and resentful voice echoed. This electronic voice was perfectly simulated to have a hoarse and slightly hoarse texture. It definitely did not have a cold feeling, but was rather charming. Core program protection? You clearly did not know of my existence, so why did you make the core program protection? Is it because of that stinky uncle with a mouth full of rotten teeth that Su Lu spoke of, or did you intuitively discover my intentions? Beep beep. You actually managed to deceive this young master. This old lady will fight it out with you. Green streams of data flashed quickly on the narrow workbench's hologram. Student Philip had discovered the abnormality of the Federal Central Computer. He was so ashamed that he became angry and cursed non-stop, as if someone was jumping around with their hands on their hips. Since he had discovered the problem, Philip immediately began to work. Although he could not see the light of breaking through the core protection of his own body in a short time, through the ubiquitous electronic monitoring network, he immediately discovered the source of the problem. The hologram on the hologram quickly zoomed in, showing a wetland that still had a faint trace of smoke remaining. My little master, where are you hiding? Philip used a very short time to scan the wetland and confirmed that Su Lu was not dead and had left. He could not help but grumble in disappointment. During this period of time, the tri-winged battleship floating in the sky above New Moon was mainly carrying out two tasks. The first was to compete with the Bureau of Proclamation's main body for the leadership of the Federation of Light. Although the central computer did not discover the existence of this fellow and did not do anything, it still firmly held the leadership. However, the embarrassed and angry Philip insisted that this was a very difficult battle, and that he had only lost because he did not have enough resources. The second task was to search for Su Li's whereabouts. However, the Federal Central Computer could not find Su Lu, and naturally, the tri-winged battleship could not find him either. Philip quietly hacked into the monitoring network and began to continuously monitor 50 important locations. These monitoring points were all locations in his memory that had a special meaning to Su Lu. Linhai State's Lihua University, including the library, the H1 area, the Iron Gate and the female dormitory. Linhai State's gymnasium, especially the underground parking lot. Shell Motor Company's headquarters, especially the Research Institute, as well as the Whitewater Security Company, the Ministry of Defense Building, the training base, and the Wangdu Youth Residence. The voice in the tri-winged battleship suddenly quieted down, and a tea-house on the street next to the Wangdu Youth Residence appeared on the screen. Outside the tea-house was a little girl wearing a pink sweater and carrying a heavy school bag. She looks very familiar. The streets of the capital in winter seemed particularly bleak. The annoying wind passed through the apartment buildings, cutting the faces of pedestrians like knives, and the bodies of trees before smashing themselves into ice shards under the walls or windows. Zhong Huiyan stood outside the floor-to-ceiling glass window of a tea-house. She exhaled a mouthful of white fog, brushed off the ice on her mask, and put it back on. Her two eyes, which were exposed outside the large mask, looked around attentively at the youth residence opposite her, not caring about the frost hanging on her slender eyelashes. The sweater was very thick, and the earmuffs were very warm. The little girl was not very afraid of the cold, but the backpack on her back was too heavy. Her feet were a little stiff, and she couldn't help but stamp her feet. She thought silently in her heart, I've already searched the Shishan courtyard and Charter Square. Could it be that I really have to go to Linhai State? She wasn't afraid of the long journey, but she was worried that in the process of searching, she would miss that guy again. Inside the floor-to-ceiling glass window, the owner of the tea house, who was also a waiter, kept looking at the little girl outside the window curiously. Doing business on the street, the owner didn't know how many strange situations he had seen over the years, but in such a cold winter, a little girl who was fully equipped to resist the cold actually stood on the street for half a day. It was really rare. What kind of perseverance did this require? He couldn't help but think of the beautiful woman who cut her cheek in the tea house that year. His heart slightly moved. He knocked on the glass and smiled to indicate that the little girl could come in to warm herself. Zhong Huiyan heard the knocking behind her and curiously looked back. After understanding the other party's meaning, she shook her head to indicate that she didn't need to. Although the big mask covered 2/3 of her face, her eyes narrowed like the moon, clearly showing the sweet smile of gratitude. A man wearing a woolen coat walked out of the restaurant next door. The man was obviously drunk, and the words he muttered indicated that he should be a government official. Just as his subordinate went to get the car, the man noticed Zhong Huiyan standing on the street side of the tea house. He saw her beautiful and clean eyes and didn't know why his heart moved. He staggered over and put his arm around the little girl's shoulder. He laughed and said, "Little girl, where are your parents?" The door of the tea house was pushed open, and the owner ran out. He pointed at him and shouted, "What are you doing?" Although through the mask, the stench of alcohol could still be smelled. Zhong Huiyan frowned in disgust. She felt that the hands that were holding her shoulders were getting tighter and tighter. She finally couldn't help but put her right hand into her pocket. Chapter 835. The drunk official squinted at the owner of the tea house. His arms were still around Zhong Huiyan. He belched and shouted angrily, "What's with your attitude? Do you know who I am?" Because of this arrogant attitude, the owner of the tea house was slightly shocked. His courage to rush out suddenly decreased by more than half. But looking at the little girl who was forcibly held in the arms of the official, he still whispered a few words of advice. He knew that on this street, no matter how drunk the official was, he would not dare to do anything outrageous. At most, he would take advantage of her. Although it was perverted, the little girl should not be in any danger. Some people came out of the street next to them and looked at this scene curiously. The official's face was a little embarrassed, as if he had been greatly insulted. He kept shouting and waving his arms excitedly, almost hitting Zhong Huiyan's cheek. In the quarrel, things like asking for the direction of the toilet and the government's special investigator being on the same level as them were not qualified to enter Zhong Huiyan's ears. She patted the drunk official's chest and abdomen and suddenly smiled. Her eyes outside the mask narrowed into a new moon. She said sweetly, "Uncle, you're hurting me." The little girl's voice was very clear and soft. The drunk official laughed foolishly and let go of his hand. He tried to reach out and pat her little face frivolously and said vaguely, "Good girl, really, ah." A scream came out of the official's mouth, which instantly covered the sizzling sound of the electric arc. He, who was attacked by the electric current, painfully covered his lower abdomen. His drunkenness suddenly disappeared, and he stared at the innocent little girl in front of him in disbelief. He twitched and fell to the cold concrete ground. There was suddenly a burst of exclamations in the crowd. The smile on Zhong Huiyan's face gradually disappeared. She looked at the official who was rolling at her feet expressionlessly. Without hesitation, she pressed the button of the taser in her hand again. The blue electric arc tore through the dry air and hit the man's lower abdomen accurately again. The cloth between his legs was burned black. This time, the crowd did not exclaim. Instead, they all gasped in unison. Especially those middle-aged men, they subconsciously tilted their buttocks backwards, as if the terrifying electric arc could hit their vital parts at any time. Their posture was extremely comical. The things made by Su Lu are really useful. Zhong Huiyan shrugged and put the stun baton back into her pocket. Then, she looked at the surrounding crowd and said coldly, "Any uncle who has evil thoughts about a little girl should end up like this." Then she turned her head and smiled sweetly at the owner of the tea house, saying, "You're a good uncle. Do you want to treat me to some hot tea?" The ambulance came and left. Perhaps it was too embarrassing, but the official did not call the police. The crowd gradually dispersed. Zhong Huiyan's feet were a little stiff from the cold. She was quite tired from the days of searching and waiting, so she went straight into the tea house behind her and asked for a cup of hot tea and a plate of snacks. "If you have any trouble in the future, just call the number on the card and tell her that the card is from me." Zhong Huiyan took a sip of the slightly hot flower tea and sighed contentedly. She stuck out the tip of her tongue and handed the card to the confused owner. She smiled and said, "Don't worry. From today onwards, except for a few people, no one in the Federation will dare to provoke you." The owner of the tea house looked at the name Nan Xiangmei on the card and the signature of a second-level teacher training foundation. He couldn't help but smile bitterly. He thought to himself, what can a female teacher do? What a childish little girl. She probably thinks that teachers are the most terrible existence in the world. Zhong Huiyan did not pay attention to the owner's complex psychological activity. Her eyes were attracted by the news on the screen. The news channel of the Federation was reporting on a meteorite impact that happened in the suburbs of the capital today. According to the news report, this meteorite impact was quite rare. The earthquake waves caused by it could even be seen as far away as Neng. Fortunately, it happened in the center of the wildlife reserve, otherwise it would have caused a lot of casualties. As for the meteorite impact S1, the Federal Academy of Science had already calculated the relevant trajectory 3 years ago. However, in order to not cause unnecessary psychological panic, it had not been made public. At this time, the news on the screen suddenly changed to another picture. The picture was of a group of buildings in the capital. It should have been filmed by the TV station's helicopter. In the center of the picture, a blurred figure was crossing the buildings at an incredible speed. Neither the high walls nor the surrounding police cars could slow down his speed. Zhong Huiyan's pupils shrank. She suddenly stood up. The teacup and snack plate in front of her fell to the ground. She did not react at all. She just stared at the TV screen and the figure running at high speed. The TV screen remained silent for a long time. In the silent picture, the figure sometimes ran like lightning through the narrow alleys. Sometimes it was like a cheetah crossing the long street. Sometimes it was like an antelope jumping on the eaves of the low houses. Sometimes it was like an ape climbing on the steep and slippery surface of the buildings. With an ability that humans could not imagine, it crossed all obstacles. He sometimes appeared and sometimes disappeared. However, he was unable to get rid of the increasing number of hunting teams and the countless flying objects in the sky. Then, the powerful voiceover of the famous female announcer finally appeared on the news screen. The Empire's spy, Su Lu, has once again appeared unscrupulously. This is the most naked challenge to the dignity of the Federation. Citizens, at this moment, the Federation needs you. Today we are all warriors. Fight your mother. Zhong Huiyan clenched her fist and muttered softly in a daze. Feng Yu was right. The ability of the Federal Central Computer was more terrifying than Su Lu had imagined. After climbing over the electronic wall and returning to the city, in just a few hours, he had encountered several of the most dangerous encounters in his life. Once the omnipresent the glory of the charter was fully activated, it was actually so terrifying. In the city, inside and outside the buildings, there were no loopholes. The whistling bullets and the whistling sound of the helicopter above his head were like countless invisible and hard ropes that were slowly and unstoppably tightening. In the next moment they were going to choke his throat and suffocate him to death. Facing the whistling cold wind, Sulu madly ran up and down the buildings. His chest rapidly and exaggeratedly moved up and down. He inhaled oxygen at the highest efficiency and converted it into much-needed energy. He keenly heard the sirens from all directions. He had no time to pay attention to the Federation News Channel's helicopter above his head. After falling into a desperate situation again, he should have felt regret. For example, he chose to stay instead of leaving with the uncle. However, no one knew that at this moment, his mood was actually so calm. Many people wanted him to die and some people wanted him to leave. However, after knowing the story of his past, he was frustrated and lonely. He needed warmth. He wanted to find his own place, so he didn't want to leave the Federation. He didn't want to leave the city that he was once so familiar with but now so unfamiliar with. From a psychological analysis, this was probably a hidden self-destructive tendency at work. Sulu faintly felt this destructive emotion, but he didn't care. Because no matter how big the world was, it was not as important as his mood. He just didn't want to King leave, die, or commit suicide. What's wrong with him? When one was on the verge of despair, it was the easiest to stimulate one's potential. Suli's brain worked faster than ever as he ran. His fingers dug into the hard concrete wall, propelling his body to draw an arc in the air. While he swept past the police cars on the street, he had already determined where he was going to run to next. According to the last lesson taught by the uncle, Sulu was no longer trying to figure out how to avoid the scanning of the charter computer. Instead, he was constantly calculating the ratio of firepower of the federal forces. Because of the dense population in the city, the Federation would use a large number of sniper rifles. Therefore, he had never left the bustling business district. Using the tall buildings tightly huddled together to block the distant shots, he strictly followed the line of blind spots and madly ran. Hard pottery bulletproof vest, soft metal anti-cutting strips, guns were still guns. In close combat on the streets and alleys, there was simply no one who could stop him. However, after continuously being discovered and hunted down so many times in an extremely short period of time, he had consumed too much of his strength in an extremely short period of time. He couldn't stay in one place for more than 5 seconds, and exhaustion began to invade his body. Now was the most dangerous moment. The Federation government was almost crazy and began to broadcast the process of him being hunted down. Even at the great political risk, they wanted to mobilize the power of the people. This method was very powerful. Sulu from the Empire suddenly became a rat crossing the street, caught in the vast ocean of the people's war. Every electronic valve in the streets and alleys was guarded by brave people holding wooden sticks. As for every Federation citizen he met who had once loved him, as long as they saw him now, their faces would become twisted and they would charge at him fearlessly. What was even more frightening was that Madman Li should be in the combat force hunting him this time. Although Sulu didn't see it, he could clearly feel the pressure. Closer, closer and closer. The powerful and violent footsteps were right behind him. Madman Li had already seen Su Li's back in front of him. With a heavy expression, he sped up his steps, the soles of his feet pounding the ground like iron hammers. As long as he caught up and entangled that troublesome person, the Federation forces following closely behind would definitely be able to easily tear him to pieces. Snowflakes floated down from the sky without warning. Mixed in the snowflakes was the dull and determined sound of a gunshot. Li Feng's expression suddenly changed. His feet reacted extremely quickly and heavily stomped down, forcibly creating a small hole in the ground. His body violently trembled as he backed up, avoiding the high-speed gunshot from afar. Immediately after, 6 sniper rifle bullets were clearly and extremely intimidatingly fired in succession. Pooh! 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 On the ground and walls, 6 flowers of cement and dust instantly bloomed. The extremely precise bullets actually forced him out of the back alley of the building. The gunshots stopped. Li Feng turned his head and looked ahead. There was no trace of Su Lu in front of him. His expression was extremely ugly. 2 kilometers away, on one of the floors of the only building that could lock onto the back alley, Magnolia silently lowered her head and disassembled the sniper rifle. Her mouth continuously chewed on the orchid-flavored chewing gum. In the past year, she had gotten used to holding the kitchen knife in her hand, so her movements of disassembling the gun were still as smooth as before. The fluttering hair on her forehead had long been cut short, but her aura was still as seductive and enchanting. Chapter 836. More than 30 metal particles that looked like buttons flew out of Su Li's hand and into the corners of the building. Amidst the muffled popping sounds, the metal buttons exploded one after another, like balloons being stepped on by the guests at a wedding. Fine blue electric arcs appeared and disappeared. The low-intensity electric current formed a closed self-melting electromagnetic field in the air, instantly destroying all the electronic chips in the room. The countless eyes in the glory of the charter were thus disabled. Finally, he had temporarily escaped the pursuit of the small-eyed combat unit of the Federation. He gasped for breath, wiped the sweat on his forehead, and lowered his head to quickly check his equipment and bulletproof vest. The hard ceramic shards in the inner lining of the bulletproof vest had already cracked in several places, and they were not very useful anymore. During the battle, he gradually grasped the feeling that Feng Yu had described. However, staying in each hiding place for no more than 2 minutes, and not being able to let the central computer calculate his trajectory and escape habits was really tiring. The gunshots that rang out in the back alley of the big building clearly entered his ears. He roughly guessed what had happened. He slowly narrowed his eyes, and the emotions in his eyes were extremely complicated. He left the relatively safe wildlife sanctuary because he could not be a savage hiding in the mountains for dozens of years. Returning to the city was, of course, not to die but to find a spaceship that belonged to him, to leave this planet. He was confident that as long as he distanced himself from the Bureau of Proclamation building, just like the precious 4 minutes and 12 seconds in the Donglan district, his whereabouts would not be detected by the central computer again. In addition, Su Lu did not deny what he had seen and heard on his difficult escape. The Federation that he once loved deeply no longer loved him. The feeling of being condemned and abandoned made him somewhat helpless and angry for no reason, so subconsciously, he wanted to do something crazy to prove something. Until the gunshots rang out, the crazy emotions in his heart suddenly calmed down. The gunshots were ironclad proof that he was not a wandering ghost in the Federation. Then, he had to be responsible for those who dared to be friends with ghosts in the daytime. If he did not find a way to leave this place by finding a spaceship, he had to fight with that damn computer in this damn city. Other than implicating some people, there was no other meaning. Doing this was not a bad guess, but a cheap guess. The scanners at the entrance of the mall silently scanned the chips on the back of the people's necks, and then transmitted the collected results to the automatic search workstation. The light screen that no one was looking at clearly showed the citizen's number, and the people carried shopping bags and prepared for the new year. With a calm smile on their faces, they did not care at all. The police officers on the streets held mobile scanning sticks in their hands and randomly selected passers-by for inspection. The device accurately reported everyone's citizen number. The passers-by and the police officers smiled and greeted each other. They did not have any strange emotional reactions to the data read by the chip behind their neck. The brim of the hat was pulled very low, covering most of his face. Su Lu silently walked along the street, watching the scene. He felt a little strange. On this planet, he was probably the only one who didn't have a chip. According to Feng Yu's mockery and the habitual humiliation of the people of the Imperium, these identity chips were like cold dog chains tied to the cervical vertebrae of every citizen of the Federation. From the moment they were born, the tiny chip was implanted in their body, accompanying them as they learned to speak, to walk, to love, to get married, to have children, to work, and to struggle until they finally died. Along with this, the AI chip scans were carried out at all times, silently or peacefully in every part of the Federation. This had already become a way of life, deeply embedded in the lives of every Federation citizen. No one would find it strange or uncomfortable. In fact, most Federation citizens would not even remember that there was an ice-cold metal chip behind their necks until they died. Su Lu was the same in the past. Except for the first time when he nervously walked through the scanning channel of the spaceport when he arrived at the capital ring, he never deliberately remembered that when he entered the cinema, the store, the classroom, or the military camp, he would be scanned by the glory of the charter on his body. It was only now that he had officially become the enemy of the charter that he began to pay attention to the details that were everywhere in his life. Without the chip behind his neck, he began to recall the life when he had the chip and clearly felt the coldness that was filled with the smell of machinery. This smell was not good. Su Lu walked through the lawn by the street with his head lowered and circled to the back of a small building. He pushed open the door and walked in. His face was too pale because of the blood loss, and he appeared particularly weak under the dim light. The breathing between his thin lips was very heavy. What was even more frightening than the fatigue and injuries was the mental struggle, which made his situation very bad. The Federation was so big, but there was no place for him to stay. Even if it was just a humble request to stand, would this small building accept him? Su Lu slowly pushed open the side door, his right hand in his pocket gently pulling the trigger. There was a faint self-deprecating smile on his face. At this point, what else could he ask for? What could he prove? It was truly a ridiculous idea. However, since he was here, he had to try. When the antique wooden door was pushed open, he did not see Li Xiaotong as he expected. His expression and footsteps froze at the same time, making a slight sound on the floor. Beside the luxurious coastal-style dining table sat a beautiful young woman. She was wearing a light blue dress, and there was a faint charm between her eyebrows, but she was eating dinner alone. Hearing the sound of footsteps, the beautiful young woman turned around in shock. When she saw Su Li's face clearly, she subconsciously raised her hands and covered her mouth tightly, swallowing the subconscious cry of surprise that was about to come out. Su Li's right hand in his pocket slowly released the trigger. He smiled slightly and prepared to turn around and leave. He knew this beautiful woman. Thinking that she would inform the Federation to hunt him down, he could not help but feel a little gloomy. "You wait a minute." The woman hesitated and stood up with difficulty. Her right hand was on the table, and her voice was slightly trembling. "You haven't eaten yet, right?" It was a very simple sentence, but it was like a spring thunder resounding through the forest. This description was absolutely not an exaggeration. When the whole world had become so strange and cold, he suddenly heard a question with concern. Su Lu felt as if his tired body was soaked in warm spring water. He turned around somewhat stiffly, looked at the woman and said with a smile, "Sister Lulu, can you cook?" In a certain manner, an old man from Liyuan Palace was wearing black clothes and a black round hat as he sat on a black ancient chair. Apart from age spots, there was more of an unfathomable wisdom or a shrewd craftiness within the layers of wrinkles on his face. The hesitation on your face betrayed the content of the phone call just now. The old man smiled and looked at Li Xiaotong in front of him. He slowly raised his right hand and said, "In recent years, you have grown very fast. Now there are not many things that can make you lose yourself. It seems that Su Lu really found you." Li Xiaotong looked at the old man in shock. He forcibly suppressed the complicated emotions in his heart and explained as calmly as possible, "I had an agreement with him before. If there was the biggest trouble, I would meet him there. Now he is there. He needs a boat. I have decided that your brother will take over the position of the head of the family." The old man from Liyuan Palace was like Lady Tai. He was very good at making thunder in silence. Without warning, he said the important inheritance of one of the 7 families. Li Xiaotong's face was extremely ugly. He said in a low voice, "I understand." "You don't understand." Liyuan Palace looked at him indifferently and said rudely, "This has nothing to do with the wrong investment. Although Su Lu is the biggest investment in your life, no one, including me, thought that he would be from the empire. So this investment is not a mistake." The old man's voice was old and calm. A complicated smile appeared on his loose face. "I am a calculative man. My 2 biggest investments in recent years, one was Macklin and the other was Su Lo. Unfortunately, both of them are F*King from the empire." These F*King words came out from the old man's dry lip. It showed that even the head of the Li family couldn't help but feel that the encounters in the world were too strange and too speechless. The old man from Liyuan Palace continued with a smile. "The key reason why you can't take over the position of the head of the family is that you still don't understand that we are the purest businessmen. We can only have things like money in our eyes. Only by being focused enough can we resist the increasingly tough government." After a moment of silence, Li Xiaotong said, "I have already informed the government about Su Lo. The woman who lives in the other building is on good terms with Su Lo. I believe she can delay him for a while." The old man from the Liyuan Palace slowly furrowed his brows. He sighed with some disappointment and said, "Being able to make a decision in a short period of time is indeed an excellent quality that a leader must possess. However, in this matter, you have made another mistake." Li Xiaotong furrowed his brows and looked up in confusion. "You have already invested so much in Su Lo, including the last time he went to war with the government. You even helped him escape from the capital. Why are you now stopping this business plan in advance and selling him to the government when there is no return on your investment?" Right now, Li Xiaotong's heart was very heavy. He explained with a slightly hoarse voice, "But he is from the empire. I said earlier that we are doing business. We can only have things in our eyes." The old man from Liyuan Palace sighed and said, "Since that is the case, why do you still care whether the target of your investment is from the empire or the Federation? In the past, our Li family didn't have the opportunity to do business with the people from the empire. Right now, this is the best opportunity. He may be a prince of the empire. Then, as long as he is alive, there is a high possibility that he will become the emperor of the empire in the future. If you had persisted in this investment to the end, then this would not only be the greatest investment in your life, it could even be ranked in the top 3 in the history of the family. Other than back then when our ancestors resolutely sold all the family property to help Emperor C, where else can we find a project with such an astonishing return on investment? What a pity, what a pity!" Li Xiaotong was silent and speechless. The reason why he had made such a decision earlier was actually very simple. It was because over the years, it was very difficult for him to simply view Su Lu as an investment target, but as a friend. When one's best friend suddenly became a person from the empire, who could be absolutely rational and calm and not feel helpless and desperate. Chapter 837. There was a knock on the door. Bai Yulan walked out of the kitchen and yelled in the direction of the bedroom, "I'll open the door." She wiped the oil on her hands on her apron and walked to the living room to open the door. Seeing the armed military police outside, her expression didn't change at all. When the Federation's combat troops had just entered the block and started to surround the apartment, she had already noticed it, so she wasn't surprised to see them when she opened the door. She just didn't expect that the leader was actually that young colonel. Bai Yulan looked at Li Feng and said, "I didn't expect you to be involved in such a small matter like catching me." Li Feng said indifferently, "Unless I did it myself, I really didn't have the confidence to catch the famous 7th group Old Bai. In fact, if you were involved in a first-order incident, the Bureau of Proclamation would have traced the location, then no one would have found out that you were the one who fired those shots. You did a great job." Bai Yulan looked at the Federation's soldiers in the corridor who were holding their guns tightly. She slowly loosened the apron around her waist and calmly replied, "Don't be so nervous. I never thought of running away." Li Feng slightly frowned and looked at her in confusion. Then, he glanced over her shoulder and saw a pregnant woman holding the wall and walking out of the bedroom. She had a big belly and looked very tired. Bai Yulan heard the footsteps behind her and her eyebrows slightly twitched. Her arm that was holding the apron became a little stiff. Her eyes that were looking at Li Feng suddenly brightened. Li Feng was silent for a moment and looked at the pregnant woman who was full of confusion. He said with a blank expression, "The government has a special mission. They need to recruit outstanding officers to re-enter the army. Your husband has to go for a period of special training." Inside the dark green bulletproof military vehicle. "How many months?" Li Feng asked. Bai Yulan slightly lowered her eyes and looked at the cold shackles on her hands and feet. She softly replied, "Soon." Li Feng slightly frowned and lit the cigarette between his lips. After a short pause, he also lit one for Bai Yulan. He shook his head and said, "I really don't understand why you still want to help him in this situation. Don't forget that he is from the Empire." "I don't believe it," Bai Yulan calmly replied. "I don't want to believe that he's from the Empire either." Li Feng removed the cigarette from his lips and spat out of the car. "But this is the truth." Bai Yulan was silent for a long time before replying with a smile, "It doesn't matter." Li Feng's frown deepened. Bai Yulan raised her handcuffed hands, removed the cigarette from her lips, and explained softly, "I joined the army when I was 15 years old. At that time, the old commander's unit was still called the 17th Division, not the 83-84 Division. Later, I was transferred to Baishui City to do some assassination work for the government. After that, the 7th Division started to do some private work." "What are you trying to say?" Li Feng asked expressionlessly. "Everyone in the army knows that Group 7 has always been a mercenary army. I am a mercenary who only recognizes money." Bai Yulan calmly said, "Little boss gave me more than 20 million. This amount of money is enough for me to sell my life several times over." Li Feng naturally wouldn't accept this explanation. But as someone who also grew up in the army, he didn't need to explain. He could roughly understand why Bai Yulan made this choice. The dark green bulletproof military vehicle fell into silence. Bai Yulan turned her head and looked out of the window. She looked at the fluttering snowflakes outside the building of the Four States Foundation with no expression on her face. At that time, he was responsible for long-range sniping and assisting Su Lo, but he left at the most critical moment. Now, he was far away from those years of fighting. His wife was pregnant, but he pulled the trigger at the most critical moment for Su Lo. The gunshot rang out again after a few years. It was the same gunshot from that year. The warm restaurant of the small building, the light blue coastal-style dining table, and the beautiful girl in the light blue dress created a warm and comfortable feeling. In this warmth, Su Lo lowered his head and quickly ate plate after plate of food. Lulu watched with a smile on her face. The two of them occasionally talked, and then returned to silence. It was a feeling of home. The difficult escape and battle made Su Li's stomach very hungry. The taste of mashed potatoes mixed with synthetic fat and green bean paste was actually not very good. But at this time, there was no time for it to swirl around on his taste bud. Lulu was a river-like person. She was very beautiful and young, but she had been in a certain industry for many years. In the autumn of the 66th year of the constitutional era, she once saw a male student sleeping soundly on a bench in a certain brothel in Linhai Prefecture. She once bent her fair and tender legs, painted her nails red, and painted the male student's face red. They gathered together and played cards together, and then she laughed without the slightest restraint. A few years later, that male student became a famous war hero of the Federation. Lulu, on the other hand, was still working in this industry. It was just that the location of her work had changed to the Sunset region of the West Forest region. In that luxurious nightclub, she bravely sat beside the war hero. After that, she had a night of memories of mozo teasing, fighting, getting drunk, vomiting, and promises. After that night, the war hero sent her back to the capital ring and asked a friend with an amazing family to take care of her. From then on, although Sister Lulu was still in this industry, she no longer had to serve anyone. She began to manage several high-class nightclubs and managed thousands of young and beautiful girls. She became a real sister. When she saw him again today, he was no longer the poor student and war hero of the past, but an imperial spy who was being hunted down by the Federation. "I thought you were already married and had children. I didn't expect to see you again." Sulu looked up at her and said with a smile, "It seems asking Li Xiaotong to take care of you was a mistake." Lulu's eyes moved as she looked at him quietly and said softly, "A person like me who hasn't studied much is used to this industry. I really don't know what else to do. Li Qishao is a good person. Although I know he did it because of you, in the end, he helped me too much." The phone on the table rang. Lulu picked it up and listened to a few words. Her brows slightly furrowed, and she walked to the window and whispered something. One could faintly see that her left hand, which was hanging by the side of her blue dress, was somewhat stiff. Sulu at the table was still eating the last plate of food and didn't notice this. After hanging up the phone, she slowly clenched her fists and suddenly turned around. Looking at Sulu, she said with a trembling voice, "Let's go." It was a very simple action and a sentence, but who knew how much courage it took? Even though she knew what kind of tragic consequences this decision would bring, the resolute expression on Lulu's face showed that she did not experience too much of a complicated psychological struggle before she did it. Sulu understood what had happened. It seemed that he couldn't wait for his boat tonight. He wasn't disappointed or angry about Li Xiaotong's betrayal, but he was somewhat tired. He looked at Lulu and said bitterly, "I'm really from the Empire. I'm a prostitute, but from the beginning until now, you haven't looked down on me, so don't feel like you owe me anything." Lulu squeezed out a smile, took the coat from the hanger, and walked to him. She put it on for him and said with a trembling voice, "If we're talking about owing, you still owe me one night." After saying this, she hugged Sulu tightly and offered her hot red lips to him. Her lips and tongue trembled because of fear, passionately asked for his lips. She kissed him with tears flowing down her cheeks. The hot lips and tongue separated. Sulu quietly looked at the girl. She took a pen and paper from the table and scribbled a few words. She whispered a few words and then left silently. The flashing police lights made the snowflakes on the street look strange. The snowflakes fell on the light-colored table through the window, like a modern abstract painting that no one could understand. The fully armed special forces of the Federation carefully searched the small building from inside to outside several times. Except for a few bloody footprints at the back door, they found nothing. In a room on the second floor, a secretary of the Li family looked at Lulu with a gloomy expression and said in a cold voice, "Miss Lulu, you have been in the entertainment industry for many years, so there should be no problem in acting. Everyone knows that the Empire people value old friendships very much, so I don't understand why you can't just stall him for 2 minutes." Lulu's hands tightly grasped the hem of her dress, but she didn't know where to look outside the window. After a long silence, she said, "I don't want to act, and you probably don't understand, I am also a person who values old friendships very much." The secretary of the Li family pointed at her face and humiliated her in a harsh voice. "You are just a prostitute." Sister Lulu slowly turned her head and looked at him expressionlessly. "Even if I am a prostitute, there are some things that I don't want to sell." "That's a good sentence. It makes me feel ashamed." Li Xiaotong opened the door and walked in. He silently looked at the woman on the bed and said, "But you should know very well what kind of price you have to pay. I have mentally prepared to die, but someone told me that I must not die." Lulu stood up from the bed and handed a note to Li Xiaotong. Li Xiaotong recognized the scribbled handwriting, and his eyes slightly narrowed. He saw a few words written on the note. "I still ask you to continue to protect her, at least until my death is confirmed, otherwise my madness will frighten the entire Federation. As the heir of the Li family, you can see this as a fun bet, and I suggest you bet that I can survive." Li Xiaotong looked at the note and slightly frowned. After a moment, he laughed self-deprecatingly, took out a lighter and burned the note to ashes. Then he calmly said to Lulu, "Pack up and come with me." The note had been burned, but the words on it had been left in the depths of his heart. He knew that Su Lu was a man of his words, so as the note said, if he didn't want to see a crazy doomsday scene, he must protect Lulu's safety until it was confirmed that Su Lu or he died. In a secluded street in the southern part of the capital, a slanted stone path extended to the entrance of a department store. Su Lu silently looked at that place, lowered the brim of his hat and walked up. His mood was no longer irritable, bewildered, and confused, but unusually calm. Now he was very clear that he couldn't die, and had to live as vigorously as before. Chapter 838. The Foothill Department Store was a wonderful place, at least for Su Lu. In his youth, which was full of the color of escape, only this store, which was hidden at the end of the stone path in the neighboring mountain of the city, and the small courtyard in the slums of the Tianjing planet of the Empire, could bring him a real sense of relaxation. The biggest difference between the former and the latter was that the kind mother and son in the small courtyard was the source of the sense of relaxation, while the department store permeated the walls and even the air. Today, he didn't buy the energy bars used by students. He took a bottle of inferior liquor and 2 bags of peanuts from the depths of the shelves and walked to the small table at the entrance. He lowered his head and silently took out the change in his pocket, put it in front of the boss, and turned to leave. The gray-haired boss put down the bowl of instant noodles in his hand and didn't count the money. He looked at Su Lu, who was about to walk out of the door, and said mockingly, "You are getting more and more impolite. In the past, you at least knew to call me Boss Xiaoshan." Su Li's back stiffened slightly. He turned his head and took off his hat. He looked at him and said bitterly, "How come you can recognize me every time? I have been running a store all my life, and I have never met a fugitive who dared to come back to buy things from me again and again like you did. I even knew that I had already recognized you when the president made the announcement. A fugitive like you is really rare, so of course it is not easy to forget." Su Lu was silent for a moment and said, "But this time is different from the last time. I am now a citizen of the Empire. There is a saying that goes, 'Old friends are as good as new, old friends are as before.' You may not understand the meaning of this saying, but it roughly means that some people are still strangers even after spending a lifetime with each other, while some people can become lifelong friends just by stopping the car and chatting for a while." The boss looked at him and said expressionlessly, "Of course, there is no such friendship between us, but in my opinion, you can be considered an interesting guy, so I am willing to spare some precious time to chat with you." The owner of the department store, who was over 50 years old and looked very ordinary, spoke in a very ordinary and simple way. However, the words he occasionally used, such as the 2 sentences, were interesting. This department store was far away from the downtown area and was located in a remote mountainside forest. Its business wasn't very good. Even the sparrows in the forest dared to proudly pace in front of the door. Looking at such a small store, one's life was probably consumed by the boring TV news and the instant noodles that were hard and soft, so how could it be considered precious? Sulu scratched his head with his empty hand, not knowing what to say. Then what should we talk about? The owner named Li Xiaoshan tapped the table with his knuckles, looked at the liquor and peanuts in his hand, and said with a frown, "According to the news, you shouldn't be in the mood to drown your sorrows. It doesn't matter what you talk about. The point is that I don't want to see someone waste the liquor in my shop." "Then how do we not waste it?" Sulu asked doubtfully. "If you treat me to a few drinks, it won't be a waste," said Li Xiaoshan's boss. A bottle of wine quickly entered their stomachs, and then a second bottle was opened. The dishes to go with the wine were peanuts, a few bags of low-quality snacks sold exclusively to students, and 2 boxes of instant noodles that were really soaked to mush. Sulu, whose alcohol tolerance was not good, had a layer of vigorous red on his slightly tanned cheek. Looking at the afterglow of the winter coming through the high-rise building across the hillside, he burped, narrowed his eyes and said, "I don't want to get on other people's boats, because I know very well that once I get on, I will never be able to get off. But it's also stupid to stay here. It doesn't make any sense except to implicate those guys like you who don't care that I'm from the Empire." He finished the cup of low-quality liquor in one gulp, licked his lips with a painful expression, and looked at Li Xiaoshan's boss and said, "From the last escape to this one, in fact, I've escaped many times before. I'm really tired and don't want to escape anymore. But the problem is that I don't want to go on other people's boats. It's wrong to stay here, but I don't want to die. What do you think I should do?" The so-called asking for advice was actually nothing more than venting his pent-up emotions. Before the boss could answer, he shook his head and said self-deprecatingly, "I've never regretted anything in my life. But right now I'm really regretting it. I feel that this emotion is very strange, very awkward." Li Xiaoshan put the cup to his lips and slowly and silently drank the liquor in the cup without making any sound. Then, he picked up 2 peanuts and a piece of dried tofu and threw them into his mouth, chewing hard without paying attention to the details, and then let out a sigh of satisfaction. He looked at Sulu, whose face was full of sorrow, and said mockingly, "Man is really an animal that is not easily satisfied. You were just an orphan in the East Forest, and now you are a prince of the Empire. You can eat meat without any scruples. What's wrong with life?" This is very similar to what an uncle of mine said. Sulu filled his cup with liquor and said with a smile. The owner of Mountly Mountain ate a few more peanuts and dried tofu. He chewed hard, and the muscles around his jaw seemed to be particularly strenuous. He said vaguely, "My ancestor once passed on the words of a wise man before his death. When you chew pickles and beans together, you will taste like walnut. But I like another sentence better, if you eat peanuts and dried tofu together, you will taste like ham." Before you were executed, you couldn't forget this sentence. This is the attitude you should have in life. The meaning of life is to eat meat and drink wine, to eat and to wait for death. When you understand this, you probably won't be like now, living such a tiring life at such a young age. Sulu stared at the wine cup between his fingers and murmured, "How can it be so easy to understand?" The boss swallowed the noodles in the bowl and continued to scold him vaguely. "If you really took the ticket and boarded that ship and followed the normal path, would you regret it when you were about to die?" Sulu thought about it seriously and then replied, "Yes, although it hasn't happened yet, at least I will for now." A young man regretting the ending that hadn't happened yet when he was old was a very clever way of saying it. The boss laughed out loud and said, "Then what are you thinking about?" "I want to leave. I want to have my own ship." Sulu slowly turned the wine cup between his fingers and looked at the boss with narrowed eyes. His eyes were very bright, and he said sincerely, "Can you help me? This is really not a joke." The boss waved his chopsticks like a sword, and the soup splashed everywhere. This is a joke passed down by my ancestor. I have studied it for half of my life, but I still don't know what's so funny about it. I guess it's because of the serious lack of information. As for the ship, I have been here all my life. I have never even been to the cinema at the foot of the mountain, let alone the space tourism. Sulu knew that the other party was not joking. He stared at his eyes in shock and asked, "You have been here all your life? You must have been to school, right?" "I am a self-taught genius." The boss paused and didn't continue to explain the joke related to these 4 words. "Then wouldn't you suffocate to death?" Sulu looked at him thoughtfully. "Can a living person suffocate to death?" The boss frowned and said, "You can surf the internet, order takeout by phone, watch TV, and when you are bored, you can go to the reserve to hunt. It's a good life." "Reserve?" Sulu looked at the man who couldn't see clearly and asked. The boss stopped his futile attempt to fish out the whole noodle from the batter, pointed to the back of the mountain with the tip of the chopsticks dripping with soup, and said, "Go over this mountain, and you can see the wall of the reserve." "Who the hell are you?" Suli's hand that was holding the wine glass was a bit stiff. In fact, he had always felt that the boss of this mountain department store was not an ordinary person, so he tried to ask about the ship. But he didn't expect that this very ordinary-looking man with gray hair could ignore the glory of the charter and go over the electronic wall. "My surname is Li, and my name is Li Shaoshan. I have said it 3 times, and you still don't remember? Why is it that every time I come to your store, I feel very relaxed, or even comfortable?" The boss looked at the young man's moved face and said, "Because in my small store, sunlight, wind and rain can enter, and people can enter, but the glory of the charter can't enter." Sulu scratched his head and couldn't hide the shock on his face. After a long silence, he suddenly frowned and asked in confusion, "Is there anyone with the surname Li in the 7 big families? Are you telling me that you are another powerful person in the Lees of Philadelphia? Don't talk about such a useless thing." The boss wiped the soup on his lips and said, "I have nothing to do with those big shots." Sulu felt that what he had seen and heard today was beyond his imagination. The man in front of him actually said that the glory of the charter, which shrouded the universe, couldn't shine into this shabby department store. It was really hard to understand and unimaginable. He subconsciously picked up the wine glass and drank it, using the rough spiciness to dilute the confusion in his mind. Then why can't the glory of the charter come in? Because this store and the mountain behind it belong to my family. When the electronic surveillance network was built, this place was excluded. I don't have the eyes of the central computer here. As for the history story, I will tell you next time when I have the chance. Sulu covered his forehead and said with emotion, "You are too mysterious. I don't understand. It's really uncomfortable. Speaking of next time, after I walk out of here today, there won't be a next time. You can stay." The boss looked at him and said lightly, "If you really don't have a place to go, then stay. No one can find you." Sulu shook his head and said with a smile, "I have already implicated a lot of people. Although I know you are not an ordinary person and what you said may be true, I still can't stay. It's okay. Your first sequence protection authority has been stripped. It just so happens that I still have first sequence protection authority. That broken computer won't allow the Federation's armed personnel to deal with me," the boss said. Today in this department store at the foot of the mountain, Sulu actually calmed down very quickly after hearing that he had first sequence protection authority. After a long silence he said bitterly, "Your store is too small, and I still have a lot of things to do. This place is indeed too small." The boss's smile suddenly became a little bleak. He said with emotion, "Throughout the countless years of my family, countless children couldn't stand the loneliness and chose to be implanted into the glory of the charter. In the end, I was the only one who persisted. It's not easy to meet someone like me who doesn't have a chip behind his neck. I thought I could have a companion. If I can't handle it, I'll come back to you. I know this is a little shameless, but if I can find my own ticket, I'll definitely come to see you in the future. Go. The boss waved his hand. Sulu packed his luggage and walked out of the door. He suddenly stopped and turned back to ask, "Can you tell me who your ancestor is?" The boss threw the bowl of instant noodles into the cardboard box at his feet and said with his head down, "My ancestor is still in the Charter Square. Of course, I never had the chance to see him, but when I thought about how he was forced to stand there and be sized up after so many years, being exposed to the wind, rain, sun, and pigeon feces, it might be better not to see him." Su Li's expression was very interesting. He thought about the 7 great families and the Lees of Philadelphia, but he didn't expect the answer to be the group of 5 that was about to become a legend. My ancestor liked to eat meat and hunt. He didn't like chips. The boss raised his head and looked at him expressionlessly. Although he had a ticket, it was a 5-person ship, so he didn't have the final say. During the voting, the guy with thick eyebrows and big eyes who decided to support him at the beginning actually betrayed the revolution after the regulations were changed to allow people to eat fish, so the result of the voting became 3-2. The white-haired man shrugged and said mockingly, "Democracy, you know." Sulu knew what to say. "I'll give you one last thing." The boss looked at him and said with a smile, "After the great calamity, the 5-person ship came to this star field. There was no federation in the universe. Similarly, I believe the situation in the left sky star field is similar. There was no empire before. In the beginning, there were no people from the Federation or the Empire, only people. So you don't have to struggle to be a Federation person or an Empire person. Just be a person." Hearing this last sentence, Sulu was silent for a long time. In the twilight, he bowed deeply to the boss and said, "Thank you for your care these days, for the nutrition bars and wine, and for today's wonderful story and these words." The sun had just sunk halfway when the leaden clouds and snowflakes impatiently shrouded the city and began to impatiently drive it away. The winter wind whistled through the street. Sulu, who had drunk nearly an entire bottle of wine, was already past the level of drunkenness, but he didn't feel cold at all. The conversation with the department store owner at the foot of the mountain had finally untied the knot in the deepest part of his heart. His mind was in chaos and his mind was clear. The Federation people, the Empire people, the East Forest people, the Upper Forest people, the West Woods people, the South Kazhou people, the Xixia people, the Dashi people, the Sunset people, the Li people, the Emohua people, the Tianjing people, men, women, old people, good people, ancestors, and descendants were all people. In Bai Yulan's opinion, Sulu was only good at simplifying complicated things. So he decided to simply divide people into bad and good people in the future. After figuring this out, he called Madman Li under the influence of alcohol. He burped and then said, "Let Lao Bai go. Don't make a good person flip out." Chapter 839. On the snowy street, beside his cheeks that were burning because of the cheap liquor, Madman Li's clear and cold reply came from the phone. "You can let him go, but you have to trade yourself for it." There was a path hidden in the woods ahead. The temperature from the cement road melted the snowflakes quickly. Compared to the piles of snow on the side of the road, the black and white were distinct and deep. At the end of the road there were a few cornice and the hills of the winter forest. Sulu narrowed his eyes and said, "If you really force me, go crazy? I'm not Du Shaoqing, and this is not the training base from back then." Madman Li's cold voice came very quickly, and he mocked without holding back. "If the Federation doesn't let him go, how are you going to go crazy? Burn down our houses, kill our men and children, and rape our women? No, you can't do that. Don't think that you can become a real terrorist because you're drunk on the emotions of a hero at the end of his road. Even if you've assassinated Macklin and killed many people, you can't use that to threaten the Federation, much less me. Sulu walked along the black and white road into the depths of the winter forest. He slowly stopped in front of an antique stone statue and said calmly to the other side of the phone, "For an unlucky person like me, in such a desperate situation, I still can't do what you said. Then, I should be a good person, right?" The other side of the phone was silent. A good person has a reason and a right to live. Sulu took a deep breath, shook his arm, and flipped over the heavy stone statue in front of him. He said, "Those who help good people live also have a reason to live, like Lao Bai." The heavy stone statue fell to the ground with a muffled thud, splashing snow and mud. Madman Lee on the other side of the phone still didn't say anything. Sulu knew that the glory of the charter was accurately locating him at this moment, but he didn't care. He jumped into the hole covered by the stone statue expressionlessly and continued, "Since I came to the capital ring from Dong Lin, I've been listening to and reading a sentence. There is no reason in the universe. Today, I'll show you a reason. If you found me, come quickly and send me someone useful." Madman Lee on the other side of the phone finally spoke. It was obvious that he was suppressing his anger and absurdity. His tone was extremely cold. "Even if my grandfather comes back to life, it's impossible to defeat the Federation and the glory of the Charter." Sulu patted off the wet mud on the big box in the pit and replied, "We'll only know after we fight." Madman Lee roared violently, "If you want to die, then kill yourself, don't drag others down. Declare war on the Federation? Are you crazy or drunk?" Sulu pushed the heavy box to the ground and burped while rubbing his stomach. Smelling the pungent smell of alcohol and peanut instant noodles around him, he couldn't help but frown and reply somewhat embarrassedly, "I really drank too much." Sulu had never fought a battle without preparation. The heavy box buried under the stone statue was the backup ammunition that he had buried in advance before the first war with the Federation. Because the firepower of these guns was too fierce, he had never used them when he was inexplicably turned into a citizen of the Imperium and was hunted down by the Federation for many days. Until today. The heavy box that was almost as tall as his chest was dragged quickly on the snow, crushing the frozen soil and frost grass. A large pile of snow and mud accumulated in front of the box, but it didn't slow down at all. In a very short time, it entered a quiet and noble garden building. This place was called the Ivy Garden. The seventh young master of the Li family, Li Xiaotong, lived here. In the front and back of the villa, all the people who lived in it were famous people of the Federation, high officials, and nobles. It was very far away from the world of the common people. It was a very cold winter, but there was artificial warming water flowing in the garden. Accompanied by the odorless fragrance of the winter plums, white snow covered the antique cornices. It was very interesting. This was the battlefield that Sulu had chosen. During this period of time on the run, he had only been running and had not launched a counterattack. There were many complicated psychological reasons for this, but now he had to launch a counterattack. Because of Lulu, because of Lao Bai, the government might even investigate Zhou. Therefore, other than being strong enough to survive, he had to use a certain method to display his powerful destructive power. He had to make the federal government feel pain and fear. Of course, he had to admit that the 2 bottles of low-quality liquor in the department store at the foot of the mountain also played a very important role at this time. Standing on a platform that led to an underground heating pump room with 3 thick walls and water behind it, Sulu fiercely spat into the stream that was piled with snow, smashed open the box, and began to organize the guns with an expressionless face. His brain began to work quickly, once again planning the escape route after the battle. A buzzing sound came from below the clouds in the distance. The shadows of dozens of twin-armed helicopters could be faintly seen in the snow. Although they were far away, the momentum was still very shocking. The snowflakes danced like a young girl's skirt. The sky was gloomy, but he could still see. The sun in the west had already set. He didn't know if it was the end of someone. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked in that direction. His hands moved quickly, and the automatic sniper rifle with the electric valve removed made a clicking sound. That day in the wet, he didn't get on other people's boat. In the end, there was no boat. But now he had an escape route. Although the world at the end of the escape route was small and strange, there were instant noodles, peanuts, and this damned liquor. What was there to be afraid of? With a whoosh, his arms accurately and quickly raised like a machine. In an instant, he perfectly aimed and prepared to fire. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. The direction of the H-12 sniper rifle was not the helicopter in the snowy sky, but the winter forest at the other end of the stream. The vigorous fire shone out from the black muzzle. The air around the muzzle suddenly shook. The snowflakes first froze, and then they were torn apart and melted. Pop, 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 pop. Once the sniper rifle fired, it didn't stop. Across the extreme shooting distance, it sprayed high-speed bullets toward the stream. Countless muffled groans sounded in the winter forest where not even a shadow could be seen. The faint sound of heavy objects falling to the ground could be heard. Sulu stood with his feet in front of him. He narrowed his eyes and maintained the most perfect shooting posture. He completely ignored the bullets coming from the opposite side. With an expressionless face, his right index finger moved quickly like lightning. He was actually using the sniper rifle as a repeating gun. The modified H-12 sniper rifle could adapt to such an abnormal shooting speed, but no matter how strong the barrel was, it couldn't withstand such continuous and fierce fire. In less than 20 seconds, the barrel had already started to turn red. Occasionally, snowflakes would fall, and with a whoosh they would turn into mist. Without waiting for the cartridge to empty, Sulu accurately calculated the time the barrel could withstand. At the last moment before the barrel burst, he threw away the H-12 sniper rifle in his hand. With a snap of his right hand, another H-12 sniper rifle immediately appeared in front of him. He continued to fire continuously from a long distance. The sound of gunfire didn't seem to have stopped at all. On the embankment in the distance opposite the stream, the sound of gunfire had long been heard. Occasionally, shrapnel would sweep past his body and hit the wall with a dense and crisp sound. There was even a piece of shrapnel that was lucky enough to hit his chest. It fiercely pierced into the heavily damaged hard ceramic bulletproof vest under his jacket. However, Sulu only slightly bent his knees. His face paled, but there was still no change in his emotions. He just stood there in the wind and snow and silently fired. Fong Yu had once said in the middle of the wetlands that dealing with the charter computer was, in fact, dealing with the people who used the charter computer. Sulu chose to start the battle here. Starting the battle now was to determine that the Federation government couldn't possibly use a truly destructive weapon to deal with him. This was the capital, a densely populated area. This was the Ivy Garden, where the powerful resided. Even the most precise guided missile would cause irreparable consequences. More importantly, Sulu had gradually come to understand that politicians were businessmen. They were greedy and incomparably confident. When they thought that they didn't need to pay a higher price to get rid of him, then they definitely wouldn't pay a higher price. In the gray and black sky on the other side of the wind and snow, dozens of twin-rotor armed helicopters were approaching at high speed. The atmosphere was solemn and terrifying. The rocket launchers on both sides of the cabin could be launched at any time. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the federal forces that were already faintly appearing on the other side of the winter forest. He placed the sniper rifle in front of him and directly lifted the two large weapons. The 6-barreled rotary Darling machine gun began to fiercely spit out flames. The high-speed stream of bullets cut the snowy sky into pieces of broken space. In the winter forest on the other side of the stream, a ricochet line that represented death suddenly appeared. Countless hard arbor trees, following the slight movement of the gun barrel, burst into mournful white fragments and bloomed with a bang. This was the Federal forces' most powerful firearm. On a crowded battlefield, it was even more terrifying than the ACW. It was usually installed in military mechas or armed helicopters. Other than a monster like Xiong Linquan, not many people could use it in single combat. At this time, Su Lu was holding the two six-barreled Darling machine guns and fiercely firing. His arms, which did not look ridiculously muscular, appeared to be extraordinarily relaxed. Even the powerful reaction force only made his shoulders shake slightly. It looked like he was expressing his contempt for the Federal forces in all directions. The Small Eyes Special Forces in the Winter Forest were directly suppressed by the terrifying rain of bullets on the embankment. They could not raise their heads at all. No matter how strong the troops were, in the face of such inhuman firepower, they had to temporarily avoid the front line. If the two terrifying six-barrel Darling's bullets were slightly lower, even the frozen and abnormally hard embankment would have been flipped over a few layers. The ammunition in the box on the platform was rapidly decreasing. The buzzing, high-speed rotation of the 6 gun barrels began to turn red. It was just unknown whether the bullets would run out first or the gun barrels would collapse first. However, Su Lu did not care about this. As soon as he finished suppressing the fire, he quickly raised the H-12 sniper rifle again and pointed diagonally into the air. He continuously pulled the trigger at the nearest armed helicopter flying in the air. The two completely different shooting methods switched so quickly without the slightest feeling of stagnation and awkwardness. The sniper rifle's bullet accurately cut through the snowy sky and hit the right rotor arm of the helicopter. The dull sound of metal breaking suddenly rang out, and a burst of sparks burst out from the rotor arm. The helicopter, which had lost its balance, twisted and turned, and fell into the cold lake, creating a large splash. Su Lu immediately aimed at another armed helicopter at a 74-degree angle to the right. The special forces of Small Eyes in the Winter Forest were about to enter the next wave of attack. He did not have the ability to deal with dozens of armed helicopters. He had to finish today's battle as soon as possible, then quickly retreat, then hide, and then fight again. However, the development of the situation was completely different from what he had imagined. Just as he was about to pull the trigger in a frenzy under the influence of alcohol, a drop of water splashed into his eyes, and his vision was suddenly blurred. At this moment, Su Lu narrowed his eyes and thought. The place where the helicopter fell into the lake was clearly a full 2 kilometers away from his shooting position. Why did the splash of water splash into his eyes? What followed was 1 drop of water, 2 drops of water, 3 drops of water, 10 drops of water, 100 drops of water, countless drops of water. The water droplets gathered into a downpour, falling from the dark clouds of snow, pitter-patter, falling on the ivy garden, which was no longer as tranquil and noble, and falling on his body. Su Lu, who was wet and cold all over, was silent. Why did it rain so freely on such a cold, snowy day? The drooping clouds he was looking at suddenly changed. It was as if there was an invisible force that was slanting forward from the sky above his head. The ink-black snow clouds were extremely disturbed by this force. They scattered in all directions in fear, forming an exceptionally clear line. On both sides of the stream, everyone above the snowy sky seemed to hear a loud buzzing sound at this moment, but it also seemed like they did not hear anything. They just subconsciously forgot about the battle, and turned their gazes to the end of the rolling cloud line. The end of the rolling cloud line suddenly tore open, revealing a huge hole. The setting sun, which had already sunk into the horizon, generously left behind a brilliant twilight like peach blossoms in that part of the sky. A spaceship bathed in this beautiful twilight, seemingly slow, but in reality, it was descending at an extremely fast speed. This black spaceship's body was densely packed with metal components using some unknown method. It was completely impossible to tell what it originally looked like. It could not even be described as broken. It was more like a pile of old and abandoned metal components that had been stored in a space garbage station for hundreds of thousands of years. However, it was such a dilapidated spaceship that descended in the final twilight, but it was enough to give the people who witnessed all of this an incomparably shocking psychological feeling. The terrifying air turbulence caused by the high-speed descent of the broken black spaceship instantly made dozens of armed helicopters around it lose their proud mobility. Several helicopters lost control and miserably fell into the lake, while the armed helicopters further away, in panic, retreated at the highest speed in all directions. The strong whistling wind passed through the ivy garden, blowing the antique cornice to the point that it was on the verge of collapsing. The cold-resistant flowers on a certain balcony shattered into pieces. The federal forces in the winter forest could not even raise their head. Sulu narrowed his eyes as he looked at the approaching spaceship. He frowned and did not understand what was going on. He subconsciously raised 6 tubes Dahlin again and aimed at that direction. "I have already poured so much cold water on you. Do you still want to continue your drunken madness?" An exaggerated mocking laughter came from the broken black spaceship, descending towards the platform he was on. It brought a large shadow into the manor, as if it was a demon that wanted to devour souls. But in Suli's eyes, this demon was extremely cute. He threw away the heavy Dahlin in his hand and thought with a smile, "So I really do have my own spaceship." Chapter 840. There was darkness in front of him, and a strange sweet smell came from the tip of his nose. Sulu knew why there was such a smell in the spaceship. Just like when he was sweeping around with the 2 six-barreled darlings, there was no way for him to recognize that the broken spaceship that broke through the clouds was the tri-winged spaceship that had saved him from the Empire. There was always a difference in the degree of being broken. Back then, the tri-winged spaceship was still considered to be in good taste, but today, it had become something beyond the imagination of the most absurd human artist. Because he did not recognize the tri-winged spaceship, he did not expect to hear the old man's voice in the spaceship. The voice was familiar yet strange, and it sounded much younger. In particular, there was a strong sense of mockery in the tone, with the mocking tone of an aristocrat, but it was so unforgettable. The soft lights turned on one by one, revealing the messy space in the spaceship in front of him. As soon as he entered the light, he could not help but squint his eyes, looking at the dusty console in front of him and the equipment that was welded to the hard alloy plate. He scratched his head and asked in disbelief, "Aren't you dead?" "I'm not you. You're an ape-like life form made of low-level carbon-based structures. How can you die so easily?" Someone's voice sounded in the tri-winged spaceship. Sulu confirmed that this voice belonged to him, and confirmed that it was indeed younger and livelier than before. A smile that came from the deepest part of his heart, mixed with fatigue, rushed to his cheeks. He opened his arms and made a hug to the invisible waves in the air. He sighed and said, "Don't play the trick of faking your death in the future. For a low-level ape-like life form like us to cry because of the death of a high-level mechanical life form like you, it's not a very glorious thing." "Have you ever cried?" Philip asked curiously. The slender mechanical arm in front of the console moved down at high speed, and the video camera at the front was very close to Suli's face. It seemed to want to find tears on his slightly dark and thin cheeks, but in the end it only found some water stains. He said in a bad mood, "I'm the one who splashed the water. When did I cry?" Sulu raised his eyebrows and said angrily, "Try crying. I'll see if there's anything on your face in a few months." "I've never cried before. Although some conflicts in the core program can be compared to human emotions, I've never found any similar emotions. Perhaps there were, but I actively excluded them," Philip said indifferently. That slender mechanical arm kept waving in front of Su Lu, like a child waving his arm to show that he didn't care about anything, and that he had to pretend to be strong because his disguise was mature. Knowing that this guy was still alive, Su Lu was in a very good mood. He was too lazy to continue the argument that had been repeated many times with him. He turned around and prepared to walk to the rear cabin to prepare for what to do next. Unexpectedly, he tripped over something and almost fell. Looking down, he saw a heavy bag tightly tied to the ground. "Oh, right, there's something I forgot to tell you." The mechanical arm was accompanied by a pleasant hydraulic sound as it quickly extended to his face. Philip's voice was a little strange, as if he was a little nervous. Su Lu didn't pay attention to what this guy wanted to explain. His gaze left the bag and fell on the depths of the rear cabin. The shock in his eyes didn't disappear for a long time, and he didn't know how to interpret the scene in front of him. Under the dim and gentle light, there was a little girl wearing fluffy earmuff. Under her long and slightly trembling eyelashes, her black gem-like eyes narrowed into two crescent moons in the sky. She stood there quietly, hugging an old doll and smiling cutely. Su Lu felt that his eyes were a little dazzled. He couldn't help but squint, thinking of the little girl he met in the starlight of the ancient bell many years ago when he first started to escape. 6 years had passed, and the little girl from back then had become the girl of today. She had grown up a lot, and her swaying black hair, like a watermelon skin, was much softer because it had grown longer, obediently draping over her thin shoulders. However, the old doll in her arms was still the same doll from back then. She still stood there quietly, looking at him with absolute trust, as if she hadn't left for so many years. Even her posture hadn't changed. Zhong Huiyan looked at him with a smile and said, "Let's go." Only then did Su Lu confirm that what he saw was real. He opened his mouth helplessly, thinking that even this sentence sounded so familiar. Back then in Xixia State, when this girl tried to run away from home again, sneaking out of the villa and getting into the back seat of the car, it seemed that she had said the same thing? He closed his eyes, then opened them, covered his forehead, and then let go. He gasped heavily, and his right hand reached out like lightning, grabbing the slender mechanical arm beside him. His fingers grabbed the bottom of the video camera as if he was strangling Philip's throat. He roared angrily, "What the F***ck is going on? Who am I? I am the omniscient Philip, Xiao Fei. Well, I can only browse the central database now and can't transfer information, but I still know your life quite well. I know who she is, I know her relationship with you, so I believe that even if she knows that I am a living computer, it won't be a terrible thing. Do you have to force me to kill her? Lulu, you are too cold-blooded." The slender mechanical arm shook violently in Su Li's hand, like a weak female hostage trying to escape in horror. Philip cooperated with his emotions at this time, performing a perfect performance, and seemed to be very intoxicated with it. "Who said I would kill her? You know I'm not talking about this stupid thing." Su Lu glared at the camera and said angrily, "I'm asking why she is on this broken ship of yours." Philip felt that Su Lu was really angry at this time, and the slender mechanical arm suddenly quieted down. The sound inside the spaceship instantly became high-speed and clear. "I tried to find you, and then I found Miss Zhong Huiyan outside the Wangdu Prefectural Ming apartment. After communicating with her, I knew that she was also trying to find you, so two like-minded partners formed a temporary search team. Today we monitored the government's information and confirmed that we were looking for you, and that you were in a drunken stupor in the Ivy Garden." "You were looking for me?" Su Lu rubbed his eyebrows and looked at the little girl who was timidly grabbing the corner of his clothes. He frowned and said, "Last time, Tai Zuan told me in prison that now the Nanxiang family is taking care of you. What happened?" "Nothing happened." Zhong Huiyan opened her innocent eyes, looked up at him and said, "Sister Nanxiang is very good to me. Although she wavered for a few seconds when she knew that you were from the Empire, in my opinion, it was already very good. Madame Nan Xiang should also be a beauty when she was young. They even specially invited a professor from the First Academy to give me a theoretical physics lesson. I have a good life in Nan Xiang Manor. Sulu released the hand that was tightly holding the slender mechanical arm, reached out and rubbed her hair, and said, "Get to the point. If that's the case, why did you run away? No matter how good it is not my home." Zhong Huiyan struggled to poke her head out from his evil hands and said seriously, "I believe that you will definitely be able to escape, so I sneaked out in advance to meet up with you." Su Lu said directly, "I am from the Empire." Zhong Huiyan frowned her thin eyebrows, obviously unhappy because of this sentence. She pouted and said, "Even Sister Nan Xiang only wavered for a few seconds. Brother, do you think this kind of thing will affect me?" Su Lu felt a little warm in his chest, but there was still no expression on his face. He said coldly, "I'll send you back right away." "No." Zhong Huiyan's face turned red and she screamed angrily, "You are my guardian, how can you leave me alone? How can I care? I am now running away, and the whole Federation is chasing me. In the next second, this broken ship may be blown into scattered garbage by a warship's main cannon. Do you want to die with me?" Su Lu sternly reprimanded. "If you don't want to go back to the Nan Xiang Manor, I'll send you to the back mountain of Macho. If that doesn't work, I'll send you to the engineering department of Harbor City. Shang Qiu is there. Haven't you always liked her?" Toward the end, his tone had become much gentler, even turning into a kind of pleading. Under such circumstances, he didn't care what kind of danger he would be in if he sent the little girl to these places, because he knew very well that it was the most dangerous thing to follow him in the universe now. "My ship is not broken." The slender mechanical arm went around Su Li's body and lowered to Zhong Huiyan's cheek. It rested on the little girl's shoulder, which was trembling because of anger, and said bitterly, "And you can rest assured that no warship's main cannon can hit us." When it came to education, the situation where parents had different standpoints was the most frightening. Su Li's expression slightly stiffened, and he said in a low voice, "Even if it's all right, can you follow us to wander in the universe? You still have to go to school, you still have friends, you can't live an inhuman life with a guy like me and this broken computer. Brother, you said that I am a real genius, and ordinary schools can't teach me at all, so I don't need to go to school." Zhong Huiyan stared at him and said angrily, "And you know I don't have any friends at all, so what's wrong with me following you?" Su Lu shook his head and still refused to agree. Zhong Huiyan's brows furrowed, and her small mouth tightly pursed, desperately holding back the urge to cry. She stepped forward and grabbed the corner of his clothes, gently shaking it, her clear and tender voice slightly trembling. "Brother, you will be lonely and bored running away alone. You should have a companion, just like on the ancient bell back then. I will accompany you, okay?" As she spoke, tears that were as clear as spring water overflowed from her eyes and trickled down her face. The slender mechanical arm slowly left her shoulder, trembling slightly, and then made a strange turn, just like a human wiping their wet eyes. Philip's sad voice kept echoing in the cabin, "It really makes one want to cry. How can someone be so heartless?" "You're still talking about it?" Su Lu stared fiercely at the front end of the mechanical arm and said in a cold voice, "If you didn't take her on board, would there be such a problem now?" Philip's voice suddenly became calm and serious as he said, "When I saw this scene, even I was deeply moved, so I decided to take Miss Zhong Yanhua on board the tri-winged warship." A two-dimensional hologram appeared in the dim cabin. Su Lu frowned and looked at it. Zhong Huiyan turned her head and stood beside him. She also curiously looked at it, her fingers never letting go of the corner of his clothes. On the hologram screen, in the cold winter wind, a little girl wearing an oversized woolen coat was slowly walking in the falling leaves and snow. The big school bag behind her seemed so heavy, and her steps seemed so strenuous. Her little face was red from the cold, but there was still a hopeful smile on her face. From time to time, she would blow 2 mouthfuls of warm air into her hands, stomp her feet, and squint her eyes to look at the sky, as if waiting for something. Zhong Huiyan pointed at the hologram screen in surprise and said to Su Lu beside her, "That's me, that's me." Philip's voice sounded again, and he softly explained to Su Lu, "At that time, you should still be preparing to escape from prison." She had already left the Nanxiang manor, and was walking through the streets of the capital. She had been to many places, such as the Shishan courtyard, such as the Wangdu apartment, just for the small hope of waiting for you. On the cold streets, in the middle of the night, she never gave up. She even tried to take a car to the port to find you. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the constantly changing images on the hologram screen. He looked at the little girl who was shivering in the cold wind, squatting at the corner of the street and vigilantly watching the pedestrians. He didn't know why, but his chest was full of a sour taste. He couldn't imagine how the little girl who was alone and had no one to rely on spent so many days in such cold weather, and how much suffering she had suffered. He subconsciously stretched out his hand and tightly held the cold little hand next to him. Zhong Huiyan smiled and let him hold her hand. She leaned against him contentedly, and her eyes narrowed into cute crescent moons. But in her heart she was a little nervous and thought silently, in fact, she had been living very well these days, but why did she look so miserable and pitiful on the screen? Should she explain to her brother? Just as Su Lu was about to say something, a deep male voice full of vicissitudes of life sounded in the space. The most unbearable and tragic memory of when he fled the Empire suddenly appeared in his mind. His face changed dramatically, and with lightning speed, he put the earmuffs on the confused Zhong Huiyan beside him, and then tightly covered his ears. The moon falls and the crow cries, it is always 1,000 years of wind and frost. The sound of waves is still the same, but there is no night of that year. Today, you and I, how should we repeat the story of yesterday? Can this old ticket board your broken ship? The broken tri-winged ship was flying at high speed on the sea, and the cabin was reverberating with the emotional chanting of ancient poems. After an unknown period of time, the chanting finally stopped, and at the end, there was a faint sound of Philip praising a little girl. Good acting. Zhong Huiyan quietly and cleverly stood beside Su Lu. Her right hand stretched behind her back and gave a thumbs up. She praised in her heart, good camera. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.